Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the 7th episode of the story that tells of what if were the second Shinobi World War left Yuzu destroyed out of fear. Its inhabitants were left slaughtered or scattered. However, what if the members of Yuzushiyo's famed Uzumaki weren't as scattered as people thought? What would it mean for one Uzumaki Naruto? After watching, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. 17 hours until chakra seal dissipates. Naruto swallowed nervously as he watched the team of IWA genin walk through the forest beneath them. An hour had passed since the exam start, and Naruto felt increasingly vulnerable with every passing second, the black tattoo on his wrist a stark reminder that, right now, he had about as much chakra at his disposal as Sakura. Maybe a bit more than that. Meaning, in short, that his skills were confined to taijutsu and whatever ceiling he could pull out of his ass. Fortunately, Shikamaru and Sakura already knew all about his situation, and between the two of them, had devised ways to ambush enemy genin without risking open battles. Right now, they were on their second team, after their first victims turned out to also have a heaven scroll. A loud groan coming from further ahead caught the shinobi's attention, also telling Naruto that the plan was on. Watching the genin from above, he saw as they quickly moved towards the source of the groaning, revealed to be Sakura. His pink-haired teammate was on the ground, nursing a swollen ankle, but also looking quite disheveled. At a glance, one might have reasonably concluded that she had gone through an extremely harrowing experience. In reality, she and Shikamaru had all but forced Naruto to smack her around a bit to make the wounds look a bit more realistic, and then had her basically roll around in mud and leaves to really sell the bit. Well, gloated the leader of the IWA genin. Naruto rolled his eyes. Could he be any more of a stereotype? Look what we have here. He watched Sakura twitch in similar irritation, but she kept to her part, making a show of trying to crawl away. No. Stay back, she pleaded half convincingly. Honestly, he couldn't blame her. These three IWA genin were acting like something out of a bad kabuki play. Where's your team, girlie? The lead IWA nin asked amidst a mean chuckle. Left you all alone, did they? Naruto narrowed his eyes. He didn't like the way the IWA nin were acting. The strut in their step, the way their body language was leaning towards Sakura almost felt like, they'll come back. Sakura shouted defiantly, still edging away. They. A kunai embedded itself in the tree trunk next to her, and all signs of pleasantry in the IWA nin disappeared in an instant. The three shinobi towered over Sakura, menacing glares adorning their faces as they brought out kunai. I don't care, said the leader, grinning maliciously. I've been itching to gut one of you Konoha hippies for a while now. Lucky me. There's one right here. Yeah, no. Naruto saw Shikamaru's signal and softly dropped down behind the group, hands already set into the formal Hakusho stance. Drawing as much chakra as he could, wincing at the effects of the chakra restraining seal, Naruto glared at the backs of the IWA nin, just as they began to realize someone was behind them. Too late. Uzumaki Hakusho, he cried out. Futego Tenkusho. Naruto's open palm struck at the IWA team's leader's back full force, the added chakra serving to significantly increase his damage. The IWA nin's back arched forward unnaturally as he was blasted away, slamming into a nearby tree before sliding down, out for the count. The other two IWA nin were significantly faster on the uptake, and were already mid-swing to end Naruto's life, when they suddenly froze in place. Good thing, too, because that strike had left Naruto feeling a bit winded. Took you long enough, Shika, Naruto said with a tired grin. He really hated this chakra seal right now. 2 fights, and he was already starting to feel tired. It didn't help that most of his techniques were chakra intensive. What the? Let us go. An unseen presence clicked its tongue. Stop jabbering and just knock them out, will you? Shikamaru grumbled from his hiding spot. Sakura, help him out. Sakura nodded and hopped back onto her feet, surprising the IWA nin. Before they had a chance to react, however, Sakura and Naruto swiftly dispatched them with a hard blow to the nape. "Geez, do you guys have to hit so hard?" Shikamaru complained as he came out of the bushes. "You know I kind of feel what they do when you hit them, right?" Sakura huffed. "Oh, stop your belly aching. You're not the one who had to play victim for the second time in a row," she chided while rifling through the IWA team's pockets for their scroll. Naruto grinned. "Besides, you're still up, right?" he pointed out, before finally hitting pay dirt. "Got it. Awa Heaven Scroll." Shikamaru spat to the side. "Damn. That's twice already," he noted. "What do you want to do with it?" asked Naruto as he held it out for Shikamaru. They still had the other Heaven Scroll they'd pilfered from the first team, a team from Taki they'd come across. For her part, Sakura was busy tying up the IWA Nin to make sure they wouldn't be an immediate threat. "It's no use to us." "Why not leave it with them?" suggested Sakura. "I mean, Naruto broke that other guy's leg, so they were out anyway, but these guys would still have a shot." "Except they tried to kill you out of spite," Naruto pointed out. "I say we burn it." Shikamaru was silent for a moment, eyeing the scroll, before glancing at the IWA Nin. "Actually, I have an idea," he said. The IWA Genin woke up drowsily a few minutes later, still reeling from their fight against the Konoha Nin. Bitterness well in them as they realized they'd been lured into a rather simple trap, motivated by their own bloodlust and arrogance. All three Genin vowed to hunt down the Konoha Shinobi and pay them back in blood for the humiliation. Or they would, if they could actually move. Looking down at themselves, they saw that they were still tied up and tied up very well, and their scroll was lying on the ground in front of them. The stupid Konoha Genin must have decided to leave it there in good faith. Fucking hippies. "Oi, Karasu, get us out of these," the leader ordered one of his teammates, who glared right back. "My hands are just as tied as yours, dumbass. Will you two stop whining? We need to get out of this mess." The leader growled as he tried to shift within the thick ropes, but found that they were very sturdily tied. He could barely move a muscle. Then the scroll moved. The leader blinked. Had he seen right? Was his mind playing tricks on him? "Hey, did anyone else see that?" "See what?" The leader nudged his head forward. "The scroll. It moved." The one called Karasu snorted. "Right. A scroll moved on its own. I swear, Kuro, you holy shit." The scroll had again moved. Or rather, twitched. What the foo? Then, all of a sudden, the seal on the scroll was ripped out and the scroll unraveled in front of them, to their horror. With dawning realization, they understood that the Konoha Genin had not just left them to their own devices, they had booby-trapped them with their own scroll. Oh, son of a bye. Boom. In an instant, all three IWA Nin were unconscious, the scroll still steaming. Standing above them, hidden in the tree branches, were their aggressors, who had been watching the entire time. "So, that's what happens," mused Shikamaru as Naruto and Sakura began playing keep away with their own scroll. Now that they knew, they had added incentive to make sure they didn't open the goddamn thing. 12 hours until chakra seal dissipates. If Naruto hadn't known any better, he would have sworn he'd stepped onto a war zone. Blood and gore were splattered everywhere in this particular clearing, and from the looks of it, it had been an entirely one-sided affair. He spied a couple of AIM headbands, as well as what seemed to be a parasol of some kind. "Geez," he mused. It was sort of disturbing him that he'd grown used to this sort of thing after the first couple of hours of this second task. "Lucky we weren't here." He felt his arm act up, and raised his sleeve to reveal the rudimentary communication seal he'd applied onto his upper arm. It worked like the Uzumaki tattoo, but had shorter range and was temporary, given that Maki and Keisuke had refused to teach him how to tattoo permanent seals until he was much more well-versed in Fuinjutsu. According to the pattern of chakra pulses he was feeling, the message was from Shikamaru. No joy on his end, either. Naruto sighed. They'd spent the better part of the day looking for teams with a scroll of earth, with no luck. So far, they'd found 4 teams, 2 from Kusa, 1 from Taki, and 1 from Suna, and all of them had been carrying scrolls of heaven. Which seemed damned unlikely, odds-wise, and Naruto had seen that it had bothered Shikamaru and Sakura as well. Beyond the merely irritating, that is. Naruto scoured the area for signs of the scroll, but found nothing. Whoever had done this had either taken the scroll with them, or had decided to destroy it. One of the Kusa teams had confessed to doing as much with other scrolls of heaven, just to decrease the potential competition. With a sigh, he channeled a minute amount of chakra small enough that his seal wouldn't try to hurt him for doing so, and sent back his own report of failure. So far, it seemed to Naruto that all of the Scroll of Earth teams were either deliberately avoiding his team, or had up and disappeared. Shortly after he sent the message, he got another one in return, again from Shikamaru. It was the return to base code, meaning they were turning in for the night. Hopefully, there would still be teams the next day. Or, at least, that was the plan. The moment he jumped onto the nearest tree branch, ready to get back to the rendezvous point, his communication seal acted up, an urgent message coming from Sakura. Naruto narrowed his eyes. A lot of the message was confusing, likely due to the speed with which Sakura was transmitting her pulses in Morse code, but if he had gotten the gist of it, she'd come across something and needed help. Naruto grit his teeth. He was in no position to help anyone, but at the same time, he couldn't just ignore a request for help, especially when it came from a teammate who could be in danger. Quickly scaling up the nearest tree, he reached the top without much trouble aside from some carnivorous slugs he deftly avoided, and perched himself at the top, until he saw what seemed to be a dust cloud rising from the forest canopy maybe half a kilometer away. Close enough. Shikamaru's signal came in at that moment, requesting further details, which was just so Shikamaru, really. Unlike Naruto, the Nara heir wasn't willing to jump into something blindly, always needing a plan. It was something Naruto could understand, even if he couldn't hold to it himself. Sometimes you gotta dive before you look, Shika, he mumbled as he sent back his intent to move in for the rescue. He ignored Shikamaru's warnings, and jumped to the next nearest tree, happy that enough of his chakra remained that he could navigate the forest without much trouble. Chakra restraints or not, he would never abandon someone in need. Sasuke was in big trouble, and he knew it. Now, months ago, hell, when he was back in the academy, he might have thought the idea of so many cannon fodder coming at him at the same time might have been insulting. Pathetic, even. After all, he had consistently ranked as the best of his class, and even after all the training they'd gone through together, he was still top dog, the closest of any of them to actual Chunin level. Reality, however, liked to kick people who thought like him in the balls. Leading to his present circumstances. Sasuke and his team Hinata and Choji had managed to intercept a team with the needed scroll of heaven fairly quickly, thanks in large part to Hinata's diligent use of her bloodline. Then, with Choji acting as a distraction, Sasuke had dispatched the enemy gen in a weaker team from Konoha with relative ease. In less than a day, his team had been ready to go right for the tower. And then the Otonin came out of the woodwork. At first, Sasuke had imagined his team was just unlucky enough to run into the foreign shinobi. Fortunately, they hadn't been all that dangerous, and were quickly dispatched. His team then renewed their journey towards the tower at the center of Training Grounds 44, only to later come across another team of Otonins. Then another. And another. And another. You get the idea. The point of it was, he had long since discarded the idea that he and his team were just that unlucky, and realized his team was being deliberately targeted. Which hadn't been a problem at first, except that these cannon fodder were draining him of chakra, and as far as he knew, they weren't even halfway to the damn tower. Already, they were on their 4th and 5th Oto teams, and Sasuke was beginning to notice that beyond the fact that they were basically hunting him and his teammates, they were also ramping up the difficulty. If only he'd managed to unlock his goddamn Sharingan by now. Katan Gokakyu no Jutsu. He cried out mentally as his chakra accumulated, formed, and finally was expelled in the form of a gigantic fireball. He watched it fly through the air towards one of the two Odo teams, just as Hinata and Choji disengaged from their own targets and rejoined him. The fireball impacted on target, but Sasuke was disheartened to see that his tiredness had made him fire the jutsu too slowly. The targeted Odo team had managed to avoid being hit, and now all 6 Odo genin were watching them carefully in a tense standoff. TCH, spat one of the 2 Odo team leaders. I can't believe our master thought you'd be worth his attention. All you leaf hippies seem good for is running away. Sasuke glared, and was about to retort, when he felt a hand push against his chest. Despite the overall lack of physical strength, Sasuke was surprised to see Hinata holding him back, eyes narrowed. Sasuke-san, she spoke softly, but no less firmly. Another marvel. We cannot afford to let our emotions overtake us, she warned. Hinata's right, Sasuke, Choji agreed, breathing heavily. We're done if they manage to split us apart. Sasuke scowled, but assented with a nod. Ever since the exam had begun, he'd begun to see his team in a new light. Hinata, shy, stuttering, weak Hinata had somehow managed to find her determination, and was performing much better than he'd ever seen her in training sessions. Choji, for his part, had also reaped the rewards of training under Kakashi, Asuma, and Kurenai. While still too gentle for Sasuke's tastes, Choji had greater self-confidence and his jutsus were far more polished than they'd been prior to their first C-rank missions. In short, the weaklings he thought would drag him down had managed to blast away his expectations. And he was grateful for it, even if he sucked at showing it. The lead Otonin spat again. A disgusting habit, to be sure, but then, Sasuke didn't exactly expect country bumpkins like these to have any manners to begin with, which only served to prove how crass Odo shinobi were. Pathetic. Is this the true might of the Uchiha? He taunted, grinning meanly. Hinata's hand kept Sasuke in place, but his temper was flaring. I mean, you don't even have your vaunted Sharingan, you worthless excuse for an Uchiha. Sasuke was just about done, ready to push back against Hinata and charge the soon-to-be dead man. Or he would have, if Hinata had not spoken up first. Your attempts to goad us into premature action will not succeed, she warned them, withdrawing her hand from Sasuke's chest and sliding into a Juken combat stance. Either fight us as shinobi, or leave us. Sasuke eyed the pale Hyuga heiress with amazement. Both of them probably knew that she was likely no match for the leaders of the 2 Odo teams, but she was still standing her ground. Choji, too, seemed to have newfound determination as he emulated Hinata and adopted Shikodachi, ready to unleash his clan's Baika no Jutsu at a moment's notice. Hinata's words seemed to have the desired effect on the lead Otonin, who glared at her. Bold words, little girl, he growled, starting to make new hand seals. His comrades followed suit. Let's see if that mouth of yours screams real good once we get our hands on you, he yelled with a lecherous grin, finally stopping his seals on Tora. Katan. Not today. Whatever the Otonin had attempted to use died in his mouth as a foot planted itself firmly against his left cheek, launching the man away and into a nearby tree, where his head hit the trunk first, prompting a very sickening crack. Before anyone had any chance to understand what just happened, however, the intruder quickly looked up and cried out a name that was very familiar to Sasuke, Hinata, and Choji. Sakura-chan. Up above, they saw Sakura grin wickedly at the Otonin. Shinaro, she cried out as she cut a rope, prompting 2 large tree trunks to swing into the remaining Otonin. 3 of the remaining 5 shinobi vanished from the area, their cries of surprise cut off abruptly as the trunks pulverized their bones and internal organs. The remaining 2 shinobi landed away, and were already frantically digging into their tool belts for weapons when they froze in mid-act. What the hell? Shouted one. We're trapped, shouted the other. Sasuke blinked, everything having happened so fast he'd almost lost track of what went down. Yet, as the dust from Sakura's trap settled, he was finally able to recognize their savior. Naruto. Then that meant that, geez, you too. Whatever happened to the plan? Shikamaru complained from somewhere behind the two trapped Otonin. Sakura's trap was supposed to take them all out, Naruto. Naruto! Choji exclaimed, shocked, but pleased to see his friend arrive to rescue them. Despite their bluster before the Otonin, Choji would have been the first one to admit they were running on fumes. If Team Shikamaru, as everyone in the Genin pool, save Naruto, called the group hadn't shown up, they would have inevitably been screwed. Naruto-kun, Hinata said, just as surprised, and just as pleased. In a split second, Sasuke watched her revert from a confident warrior to a shy, blushing mess. He eyed Naruto, then glanced back at Hinata. Was the blonde fool really the source of her shyness? Or was it her strength? He couldn't understand either option. Sasuke wasn't one for acting surprised, however, so he collected himself and offered a cool look at his comrades, frowning at them. Naruto, for his part, rolled his eyes at Shikamaru. Oh, come on, Shika, he said dismissively. You saw what that Oto jerk was doing. Any longer and it would have been much worse, you know? There was a sigh from somewhere in the bushes. Fine. Anyway, can someone please knock these idiots out? I'm getting pretty tired holding them in place. I got them, Sasuke spoke up, unwilling to let the class dobe take all the glory. With efficient chops to the nape, both Otonin went down. Moments later, Shikamaru emerged from his hiding spot, nursing an aching nape. Geez. If it isn't one, it's the other, grumbled the pineapple-haired Nara heir. Oh, quit your bitchin', Sakura chided as she landed nearby. She looked over at Sasuke and, despite blushing, seemed able to restrain herself from tackling him in a hug or going all emotionally haywire. Are you alright, Sasuke-kun? She asked shyly. Never before had the fruits of working together for prolonged periods of time as part of the Genin pool been so apparent. Due to their constant exposure to each other, and the added discipline provided by two other teachers, neither Sakura nor Ino had been allowed to indulge in their more fangirlish attitudes. Didn't mean they didn't still dream about him or write about him in their diaries, though. Was all Sasuke had to say, before marching up to Naruto. What are you doing here, Dobe? He asked. Naruto's eyebrow twitched in irritation. Even though they'd all gotten used to each other, and were more or less friendly most of the time, Sasuke and Naruto still acted like they were an insult away from beating the crap out of each other. It would be cute if they didn't almost literally spend every waking moment trying to outdo each other. Saving your ass, apparently, Naruto smirked. Sasuke glared, but stayed silent. There was no denying that. The wave of Oto teams had exhausted him and his team, and he was in no position to argue otherwise. Even if he did, Choji and Hinata would likely set the record straight. It annoyed him, but kept him honest, he supposed. He had no idea that while he thought the changes to Hinata and Choji's personalities were amazing to him, his own lack of bluster and arrogance was a major change for the rest of the Genin. Yeah. I'm the greatest, no I am, Shikamaru said tiredly as he approached the group. Give it a rest. Sup, Choji, he greeted his portly friend, who smiled and nodded back. How's the team treating you? Hey Shika, Choji replied. We've been doing okay. Kinda hungry, though. Hinata, I'm glad to see you're okay, Sakura told her female counterpart with a grin. The Hyuga heiress smiled and bowed. Thank you for the help, Sakura-san, Hinata thanked humbly. I'm afraid we were at our limits when you arrived. Heh. Naruto said, grinning and rubbing his nape. These pansies were nothing. Sakura whacked him upside the head. Idiot, she chided, ignoring how he was now making an exaggerated show of being hurt. If they hadn't been distracted, there's no way that would have gone so well. Did they get your scroll? Shikamaru asked Sasuke, getting right back to the main topic at hand. Sasuke shook his head, producing both of his team's scrolls. Any other team, and Sasuke would have suspected them of trying something. However, he had Sasuke fangirl number 01, the honorable, but dumb dobe and the laziest genin of all time to deal with, none of whom had it in them to do something that underhanded to their friends. Naruto's eyes bugged out. "What?" he yelled, before turning away in disgust and throwing up his arms. "And we haven't found a single Earth scroll in all this time." Sasuke felt a little more accomplished now. At the very least, he trumped Naruto in this stage of the exams. "We got it off one of the older Konoha teams," he explained. Shikamaru frowned, but said nothing else. Truth be told, none of their generation's genin had had much interaction with the older genin teams still in circulation. As such, beyond the fact that they were all Konoha shinobi, there wasn't much inter-team friendship to be had. And let's face it, if the older genin couldn't handle a newbie team, they weren't ready for the rank of chunin. "Sakura, Naruto, check the Oto teams for scrolls," Shikamaru ordered. He'd seen the way Sasuke and Choji were eyeing Naruto, and didn't trust the blonde to give a level-headed and comprehensible summary of their situation. Left with Team Sasuke, Shikamaru sighed as he preempted Sasuke's troublesome line of questioning. "Naruto's been holding out on us," he said. Sasuke narrowed his eyes, while Choji blinked in surprise. Only Hinata seemed unsurprised by the news, instead letting out a sigh of relief. "Explain," Sasuke demanded. Shikamaru frowned at him. He didn't have to be quite so rude about it. He's got family circumstances. He decided not to reveal everything Naruto had told him out of respect for his friend's privacy. As a result, he had to hide his skills for the benefit of outsiders. More than that, he had to convince them he wasn't acting, so he had to fool us too. "Shika?" Choji spoke up, glancing over at Naruto, who'd just gotten beaten by Sakura for some inaudible comment he'd said. "We've all known Naruto most of our lives. He's not that subtle." Shikamaru glanced back at Naruto, debating whether or not to proceed, before deciding that, in the interest of his upcoming proposal, he had to come clean. He raised a hand and pointed at his wrist. "He's been sealed," he said. "By my calculation, he's got 10 hours before it goes away. In that time, he's got less than a tenth of his chakra available to him." Hinata's eyes widened, having now connected all the dots regarding Naruto's strange behavior. His chakra being sealed completely explained his behavior during the first test, as well as the fact that his hero rescue had involved only taijutsu, backed up by a trap from Sakura. If he'd been in prime condition, like in Nami, she had no doubts he would have flooded the Otonin with Kage Bunshin or tried some technique on them. Sasuke, for his part, was a little more disbelieving. He couldn't fathom what sort of reason a person could have to willingly have their chakra sealed so close to the Chunin exams. Especially when that person was Uzumaki Naruto, who basically lived to prove to others his worth. Choji, of course, had the least trouble believing Shikamaru. His oldest friend in the world wouldn't lie about something like this, and Choji had always liked Naruto, whenever he wasn't being a jerk, so he had no trouble revisiting his judgment of Naruto's skills. If Shikamaru said it was so, then it was. "Oh, come on. Another heaven scroll," roared Naruto in disappointment behind them. Shikamaru ignored it, having gotten used to Naruto's utter lack of emotional self-restraint. "What's your plan now?" Shikamaru asked, hoping they were done with this troublesome topic. Sasuke frowned. "We were headed to the tower when the Otonins ambushed us. I guess we'll keep going," he said, putting away his teen scrolls. Hinata seemed troubled by his announcement, torn between glancing at either him or Naruto, but Sasuke paid her no heed. Whatever her feelings for the dobe were, they were being tested right now, and he was damned if people looked down on him over sentimentalism. Shikamaru nodded, having expected that answer. Behind him, he could still hear Naruto and Sakura rifling through the Otonin's pockets, constantly arguing as they did so. "Troublesome. I think we should team up," he said bluntly. Sasuke's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Why?" he asked suspiciously. "We're done." There's nothing for us here. Reinforcements, Shikamaru said simply, pointing at them. Looking down, Sasuke could see what Shikamaru meant. Neither him nor his teammates were in any condition to venture off alone, with dozens of potential enemy teams waiting to ambush the next team to pass them by. Having Shikamaru and his team around would allow them to take a breather while they recuperated, and improved their odds of success considerably. Ano, Hinata spoke up, having reverted to her shy persona. Seriously, was Naruto some sort of emotional switch to her? "Do think Shikamaru-kun's idea is a good one, we're all a bit tired," Sasuke, Choji added in agreement. "We could use the help." Sasuke closed his eyes and frowned, making a show of thinking on it. Truth was, he was ready to agree already. As much as he liked to boast he could kick Kiba and Naruto's asses any day of the week, Sasuke knew his own limits better than anyone else and he was fast approaching them. If more Oto teams came out of the woodwork while his team was alone, they would likely be unable to last very long before being overwhelmed. "Fine," he agreed at length, opening his eyes and uncrossing his arms. "We work together, but only on the way to the tower," he added. "If we come across an earth scroll before we get there, it's yours. If not, you're on your own." Sasuke. Choji protested. Even Hinata seemed troubled. "Deal," Shikamaru said immediately. Honestly, he'd expected worse terms, and while he did acknowledge that he had the upper ground in this negotiation, he was also desperate for reinforcements to buff up his team while Naruto's seal wore out. "But we start tomorrow. After a night's rest." Sasuke frowned, but then slowly nodded. Extending hands, both genin leaders shook on it. And thus was Team Sasuke Shikamaru born. Meanwhile, at a local Konoha in Shuko frowned as she sat in the lotus position in the middle of the room. Beneath her, occupying most of the room's floor, was a rather large map rendering of the village of Konoha. Every inch of detail her clansmen had managed to obtain as they'd subtly scouted out the village had gone into this map, and at long last, Shuko was ready to put it to use. "Are the seals ready?" she asked as she brought her hands together before her, palms pointing up. "Have the chakra barriers been set up?" For clansmen knelt at the corners of the map, each of them in the middle of a circular pattern of fuinjutsu formulas. "Yes, Shuko-sama," they acknowledged in unison. Shuko nodded. "Good, that way, the Konohanin wouldn't know what they were doing." "Then let us proceed," she said imperiously. Of the few things in life that warranted her to drop the childish facade, sealing was one of them. One could not afford to be careless when it came to fuinjutsu, as even the slightest deviation in sealing formulas could potentially be catastrophic. With lightning speed and frightful precision, Shuko's hands went through hand seal after hand seal, until she finished on an unfamiliar seal one invented solely for the purpose of the Uzumaki clan's fuin techniques. "Uzumaki fuinjutsu," she intoned, her eyes closed as the map beneath her began to glow. A circle of fuin characters formed around her as the technique activated. "Cheeto." From her sealing circle, 4 lines of characters shot out, one towards each corner. Once the lines of characters connected with the sealing circles of Shuko's clansmen, the map's glow intensified, and she watched as the map began to sprout dozens, then hundreds of tiny lights. Her very own tactical map of Konoha. Shuko smiled in self-satisfaction at the sight of her work. Keisuke and Hayako were probably too stubbornly honorable to ever do something like this, but Shuko hadn't managed to keep her cell intact for decades by winging it through life. All survival rested upon strategy. Whether that strategy was the product of forethought or on-the-fly planning was irrelevant. Strategy was key to all victory. And to concoct a successful strategy, one needed to have information. And now she had that. That said, getting it to work had been a bitch and a half. Giving the map a cursory overview, she noted that only the village's shinobi population, or at the very least, those with detectable chakra levels, appeared as lights. Any civilian or shinobi suppressing their chakra, however, would not appear, so its usefulness was limited. Then again, considering this was the product of about 2 days of scouting and seal placing, Shuko considered the map fine work indeed. Shuko-sama, one of her clansmen, spoke up from his kneeling position. May I speak freely? Shuko slowly dropped her hands to her thighs and rested them there, glancing over at her subordinate. Go ahead. The man seemingly composed himself, swallowing nervously and all, before speaking. Was it wise to antagonize Keisuke-sama and Hayako-sama? Shuko's eyes narrowed, prompting a nervous swallow from the man, but she quickly disengaged her eye contact in favor of the map before her. The man got the message. I apologize, Shuko-sama, he said quickly. You may leave, she said dismissively to her clansman, who didn't need to be told twice. Left alone, Shuko sighed as she tiredly raised a hand to her head. She knew she shouldn't have acted that way towards her clansman, especially since, objectively speaking, he had valid concerns. It was one thing to refuse Keisuke and Hayako's overtures. It was another to deliberately antagonize them. Despite their faults, Shuko was well aware of their virtues, and she could still remember the days when they were all friends, back in Yuzushiogakure. Bachan. Shuko's head shot up, eyes wide. Where had that voice come from? She went for the window, and looked out into the streets. Families were coming and going, all out and about as usual. She could see children laughing and playing, parents scolding and talking, normal lives playing out. Shuko sighed, raising a hand to her head again as she sat down on her futon. She was hearing ghosts again. Seeing Keisuke and Hayako had dredged up bad memories she had buried deep down just to survive. The last time she had allowed her ghosts to rule her life, she had nearly known. That was another time. When she had lost all guidance. She heard someone knocking at the door. Shuko-sama. Tashiko called out on the other side of the door. I'm back with the sweets you asked for. Shuko smiled sadly to herself before shaking her head furiously and smacking her cheeks. She had to snap out of her funk, no matter how desperately her buried memories tried to come back. Tashiko and her clansmen were the one light she had left in the world, and she didn't want those eyes to haunt her life ever again. Coming, she cried out happily as she skipped over to the door, opening it for Tashiko. The younger woman was saddled with every sort of Konoha specialty candy, and looked about as excited as Shuko was about eating them. Both women had stars in their eyes as they laid out the candy on Shuko's futon, wondering how they'd go through it all. I want that one. Shuko demanded, pointing at what appeared to be a red-colored, gelatinous, string-like confection. Tashiko pouted, then pointed at what appeared to be chocolate balls. Then I get those. Shuko made a show of gasping in outrage. No fair. You know I love chocolate. But you got the red string thing. But I love chocolate, she insisted petulantly. Well, so do I. And so it went for a good 20 minutes, until they had split every candy Tashiko had brought. In the end, they decided to split the chocolates, an outcome Shuko had already predicted. Shuko-sama. Shuko, who was resting her head on Tashiko's shoulder, remained with her eyes closed, even as she enjoyed the feeling of Tashiko stroking her hair. This is a nice village, you know. Shuko said nothing, her eyes drawn to the map she and her clansmen had created. Tashiko only knew as much as they had, only what Shuko had allowed them to know. They thought it was merely another addition to the clan's increasingly large collection of maps, stored back home at their hidden clan compound. If she'd known the truth, Shuko imagined Tashiko would have protested vociferously. Shuko responded at length. It's all right. It's so peaceful, Tashiko mused as she looked out the window. I can see why the others love it here. Shuko remained quiet. She understood as well. Unfortunately, there were other considerations that overrode such sentimentalism. Vengeance, for instance. The next day, Uzumaki compound 6 hours until the chakra restraining seal dissipates, Keisuke-sama. Keisuke looked up from his calligraphy as Akemi appeared via Shunshin and knelt before him, looking flustered. What is it, Akemi-chan? he asked gravely. Ever since Shuko's distressing visit, the entire clan had been on the verge of a panic attack as they realized their beloved clan head candidate was out there in the forest of death with virtually none of his chakra at his disposal. It made Keisuke wonder just how deep Shuko's hatred of the villages went that she would willfully endanger the life of a child. Hokage-sama has come to the compound, she reported urgently. Keisuke's brush halted mid-stroke as his eyes widened. Of all the things he hadn't expected to take place, Hiruzen making a personal visit to the Uzumaki compound was one of them. Especially given the Hokage summit currently underway. He requests a meeting with you. A nice way of saying he wanted to meet. Right now. No objections. Keisuke felt beads of sweat run down his head as he considered what might be on the Hokage's mind. Had Shuko's presence been leaked? Had she somehow done something which had attracted the Hokage's ire? It would be just like her to cause mischief when it suited him least. He couldn't discard the idea that this was her way of forcing the Uzumaki back into hiding for whatever grand scheme she had in mind. And there was no question that she had a grand strategy at work here. Shuko was many things, but stupidly reckless was not one of them. Either way, it was time to face the music. Show him in, he ordered. And tell Hayako, Akemi bowed her head even deeper. Apologies, Keisuke-sama. Hokage-sama was explicit that he only wanted to see you. Keisuke wondered why, but had no choice other than to comply. With a nod, Akemi was gone, leaving Keisuke to his thoughts. Setting aside his brush and calligraphy kit, Keisuke ran every scenario he could think of in his mind, but found no clear winner as to the most likely topic of this conversation. Before he could even formulate a decent answer to his own query, however, there was a sharp knock at the sliding door. Composing himself, Keisuke took a seat in the middle of the room off his dais and cleared his throat. Please, enter, he said firmly. The door slid, revealing Hiruzen in his Hokage robes, minus the hat. His pipe was missing as well, and his gaze was unreadable. Keisuke, he greeted pleasantly. I apologize for the sudden intrusion, but I was wondering if we could have a chat, just between us old men. There was no question in that request. Keisuke bowed his head low, as befitting his lower rank. Of course, Hokage-sama, he said humbly. We are honored to have you in our humble compound. Akemi. The red-headed girl appeared nearby, already kneeling. Hi, Koro-sama. Without even raising his head, Keisuke nodded. Please obtain some tea for Hokage-sama and I, he ordered politely. Hi, Koro-sama. Vanishing in silence, she left Keisuke and Hiruzen alone in Keisuke's calligraphy room. The Hokage looked around, taking note of Keisuke's work, as he approached the Uzumaki elder and finally sat down. You have excellent brushwork, Keisuke, Hiruzen observed as he sat down. I myself try to set aside some time every now and then to practice my brush strokes. You honor me with your approval, Hokage-sama, Keisuke said in deference. However, may I ask? Hiruzen brought out his pipe from the folds of his robes and lit it up with a simple fire jutsu. Why I've decided to come see you personally today, of all days, he finished for Keisuke. The Uzumaki elder responded by way of a nod. Why do you think, Keisuke? There was a pause. The summit is not going well, he ventured. He didn't dare to think that the Hokage had found out about Shuko, or the problems with Naruto's seal. Hiruzen chuckled. That's an understatement if I've ever heard one, he said with a weak grin. I'm afraid this business of Nami has ruffled a bit more feathers than we'd imagined, Keisuke, he said seriously. And the fact that not one, but 3 Uzumaki clansmen were at the heart of the affair, Keisuke didn't need Shuko around to connect the dots. The other villages believe we are attempting to regain our homeland. Re-establish Yasushi Ogakura. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow. Are you? Keisuke sighed as he raised his head at long last and faced the Hokage plainly. There was no way the man would believe him if he could not meet his eyes as he gave his answer. No, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen puffed his pipe. But you've thought about it. Keisuke chuckled. A chance to regain the homeland we'd lost, he mused. Wouldn't you? Hiruzen cracked a small smile. I suppose I would, yes. Keisuke nodded. But we've long since come to terms with the fact that we cannot do this, Hokage-sama, he explained. All of us wish to return to the holy lands of Yuzu, but we also know we would not survive the wrath of our enemies, who would hardly wait for us to rebuild our village to strike, he observed. Konoha has been good to us, he said carefully. Truth be told, there were still some minor incidents here and there, mostly due to their relationship to Naruto and his status as the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi. And the younger generations have started to put down roots. I do not wish to tear them away from a chance at a normal, happy life. The way the Hokage stared at him, Keisuke felt his entire being was analyzed by the man some called the Professor. The man's ability to analyze jutsu were legendary, and Keisuke briefly wondered how much of that ability translated into analyzing people's worth. I believe you are being honest with me, Keisuke, the Hokage said at length. And this is something I appreciate. Thank you, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen raised a halting hand. However, my appreciation is irrelevant, in this case, he said. Keisuke blinked, feeling a chill run down his spine. Hokage-sama? Hiruzen puffed at his pipe again. Keisuke now identified it as a sign of stress. I'm afraid the Uzumaki clan has burst out onto the world stage rather too abruptly and violently, he said. The other Kage have made their displeasure at your return rather clear. They are demanding, well, let's call them concessions. Keisuke didn't like the sound of that. Concessions, Hokage-sama? Hiruzen sighed, breathing out some smoke. Hostages, guarantees, restrictions, he clarified. That chill Keisuke felt became outrage. They want to steal my clansmen. Treat us like criminals, he asked softly, but dangerously. They claim this is the best way to guarantee that the dreaded Uzumaki Fuinjutsu isn't turned against their villages, Hiruzen explained before tapping his pipe against his knee, unclogging it. I have not yet given them a reply. But you have one in mind? Keisuke asked, dreading the answer. I have many in mind, Hiruzen said diplomatically. What should worry you, Keisuke, is not my intention, but the feelings of this village you wish to remain in, he pointed out. Hokage-sama? Hiruzen set aside his pipe, fixing Keisuke with a stern glare. We have liked to pretend otherwise, but we stand at the brink of a major international crisis, he said. Your clansmen's actions in Nami have destabilized the status quo, and now not only the shinobi villages, but the daimyos as well have all weighed in on the crisis. Our daimyo, our king, has made it clear he wishes to absorb Nami into our sphere of influence. As a result, the daimyo of Mizu has expressed his desire to retain control of Nami via its puppet daimyo. He paused. Armies are being drafted, Keisuke. The Hokage didn't need to explain the gravity of such a situation to Keisuke. While the daimyos had basically allowed the shinobi to act as their unofficial armies in recent times, it was always under the understanding that the daimyos could in fact raise their own forces independently of the shinobi. However, such a thing had not been seen since the Sengoku Jidai. When word of the situation gets out, and we both know it will likely get out, the Hokage pressed on, the villagers will need someone to blame for this return to hostilities. Those scapegoats will likely be you and your clan. There was deafening silence in the room as Keisuke processed this warning, for he knew it was just that, a warning. Not a threat, as some might have suspected, but a true warning. He knew the Hokage had no reason to divulge what he just had, and was torn between being thankful and being outraged at the position his clan had been reduced to. It also made another decision for him far easier. If this was the state of things, then bringing up Naruto's present circumstances would have been most unwise. Like adding fuel to a raging fire. Hiruzen stared at him analytically before sighing. But well, he said, getting to his feet, prompting Keisuke to follow suit. The summit is still ongoing. Things may yet change. I get the feeling my fellow Kage want to stick around for the third test, at the very least. Perhaps, in that time, we can convince them to change their minds. Keisuke nodded slowly and bowed at the waist. Thank you for your counsel, Hokage-sama, he said sincerely. The Hokage stared down at the diminutive man for a moment before smiling. I am fond of you and your clan, Keisuke, he said. You have brought new life into this village, and you have returned Naruto's happiness. For those two things alone, I am grateful to the Uzumaki clan. Let us see if we can't solve this predicament we're in, for the benefit of all, Keisuke nodded slowly, bowing once again at the waist. The Hokage nodded and left. The promised tea never arrived. Training Grounds 44, the Forest of Death. Chakra restraining seal dissipates in 4 hours. Where were the Earth Scrolls? Naruto raged internally as he and the rest of Team Shikamaru Sasuke continued their trek towards the tower. Along the way, they had come across more teams, and dispatched them one after another, and Naruto was still finding it hard to believe that they had yet to come across a single Earth Scroll in that time. This is either the most amazing case of bad luck I've ever seen, or someone's deliberately messing with us. Shikamaru had summed it up quite nicely after the 4th team they'd encountered that day. Naruto had to agree. As bipolar as his luck tended to be, he had never lived through such improbable results in his life. There was just no sense in every Earth Scroll in the forest to have vanished. Even worse, they had seen the enemy Shinobi acting much in the same way as his team was desperate and confused. No one they came across seemed to understand why there was such a preponderance of Heaven Scrolls. Shikamaru, Sakura, Hinata, and Sasuke had even discussed the possibility that the exam proctors had slanted the amount of scrolls to reduce the amount of teams that could move on to the next round. Shikamaru, however, had shot that scenario down after the 6th team they'd come across. Even if Konoha reduced the number of one type of scroll, he'd explained, we firstly don't know if it really is the Earth Scroll they chose to reduce, and secondly, we have no way of proving it. In addition, between our two teams, we've tagged at least 22 teams, not counting ourselves, possessing the Heaven Scrolls, which is already over 50%. Yet, within an hour of the test beginning, Sasuke's team was able to come across an Earth Scroll. I won't say the odds aren't stacked, he'd mused, but it seems likely that this is not a deliberate plan by our village. So, of course, that left the probability that they were being messed with. The problem was, all that did was piss them off, but without a clear target to attack, all they could do was stew in silent, or not so silent, in Naruto's case, rage while they desperately tried to acquire an Earth Scroll. It didn't help that Naruto had felt this irritating ringing sound in his ears ever since this second day had begun. He cuffed at his ears in a desperate attempt to get the tinnitus to go away, but as usual that only provided temporary relief. Oi, Shika, he called out to his friend up front. He landed roughly on the nearest tree branch. Shikamaru and the rest of the combined team did the same. The pineapple-haired boy sighed as he straightened up. What, Naruto? He asked irritably. We're almost at the tower. Aren't you guys hearing that? The blonde growled as he again cuffed at his ears. That ringing sound. Shikamaru and Sasuke narrowed their eyes, while Sakura glared in irritation, and Choji and Hinata looked on in concern. What sound, Naruto? Shikamaru asked carefully. He hadn't heard a thing, but by now he knew better than to doubt Naruto's word. Prankster or not, the boy was all business when it came to missions. Sort of. Fate-ringing sound. Naruto growled with increasing intensity as he began to hear it in his other ear now. Damn it. Oi, Naruto. Sakura called out. Knock it off, already, will ya? Naruto-kun. Hinata exclaimed softly as she watched the blonde fall to one knee. Oi. Naruto. Choji cried out as he jumped to aid his temporary teammate. Shikamaru and Sasuke remained motionless, though there was concern written all over the former's face. The two level-headed shinobi exchanged glances. "Shikamaru," Sasuke began. Shikamaru nodded. "I was wondering if they'd try again," he mused. And clearly, they'd decided to get rid of the only member they hadn't seen use any jutsus, probably assuming he was the weakest. It made sense with their weakest member incapacitated. They, as Konoha hippies, would probably try and help him out. That would give the ambushers, whoever they were, enough time to set up their formations and get ready to drop on them. "Hinata," Shikamaru called out, snapping the Hyuga heiress from the mild panic attack she was undergoing at seeing her crush in such distress. The pale-eyed girl turned to her friend, who remained stoic in the face of Naruto's pain. "I need you to scout out the area." Quickly, he snapped, seeing her glance over at Naruto. Any other day, he might have considered her crush on Naruto cute and troublesome, but today, right now, it was just troublesome. The best she could do to help the blonde out right now was acting like a shinobi, and getting ready for the imminent trap that was about to close on them. "Byakugan," she mumbled, her veins bulging out from around her pale eyes. Almost immediately, she reeled from what she was seeing. 81215 enemy shinobi, all around us, she reported, stunned. How had they managed to sneak up on them? Shikamaru cursed their luck. Or rather, Sasuke's luck. Eyeing the raven-haired boy, the resident boy genius knew that neither Choji nor Hinata made a sensible target for deliberate attacks, a theory vindicated by careful questioning of the aforementioned duo. Hinata and Choji had attested that, during their previous encounters with the Otonin, the enemy ninja had been especially attentive to Sasuke. "Any idea what they want with you?" he casually asked his co-leader. Sasuke grunted. "Beats me," he then said. "But if they're coming at us with 5 teams worth of genins, I must have pissed off someone in Oto," Shikamaru sighed, still keeping Naruto's pained figure in his peripheral vision. He knew his friend's pain was no joke, but he couldn't afford to slip up at this critical juncture. Whatever these enemy shinobi were after, he had to make sure that his friends made it out alive from the encounter. "Come out," he shouted suddenly, surprising his teammates. "We know you're out there." There was a brief moment of relative silence, broken only by Naruto's whimpering as he cradled his ears, before 3 figures jumped into view. 2 boys, a girl. All wearing Oto forehead protectors. None of them were making a single sound, meaning they weren't the ones responsible for Naruto's pain. "We're going to have to make a break for it," Shikamaru mumbled to Sasuke, who shot him a sharp look. "Don't give me that," he hissed. "We're outnumbered, surrounded, and Naruto's out for the count. We need to regroup." Sasuke seemed of a mind to disagree, but was robbed of the chance by the leader of the 3 Otonin chuckling. "Retreat?" he asked through his facial bandages. Honestly, he looked like someone who'd broken out of the emergency care ward at the hospital. "What makes you think you'll get the chance?" Shikamaru growled. Of course Otonin would have exceptional hearing. Why wouldn't they? The lanky boy next to the leader snickered. "Looks like Taiyuya-senpai's technique did the trick," he observed as the Otonin watched Naruto writhe. "I'm a bit disappointed at how weak these Konoha trash are, though." The Konoha teams became a bit more alert. Taiyuya, either that was these Otonin supervisor Jonin, or someone else in the exam who had techniques to watch out for. "Shut it, Zaku," the Oto leader snapped. "We have our orders. Kill the Uchiha. Leave no witnesses." The lanky kid called Zaku grinned, a crazed look passing over his features as he swung up his arms, which Shikamaru and Sasuke only belatedly realized had some form of opening at the palms. Shikamaru's eyes widened. He had a fair guess at what was about to happen, and given his posture and movements, he was aiming at Hinata. "Sakura! Get out of the way!" Sasuke called out. Fortunately, their improved training paid off, and both Kunoichi were able to jump away as the lanky kid swung forward his arms. "Zankaha!" the Otonin roared, unleashing twin blasts of something at where the 2 girls had been standing. The branches were completely pulverized. Holy crap. Choji swore as he jumped back to Shikamaru with Naruto in tow. Both girls had come out unscathed, but the Konoha Nin were all somewhat unnerved by the destructive potential of the technique. Stay calm. Shikamaru called out. He's obviously mid to long range, he pointed out before turning to Sasuke. Sasuke, can you deal with him? He asked. The Uchiha prodigy glanced at his co-leader and nodded. I thought you wanted us to run, he asked wryly as he brought out a kunai. Shikamaru glowered at the enemy shinobi, who seemed completely at ease with the fact that the two Konoha kunoichi had avoided their opening salvo. I still do, he confessed. But we're obviously going to need to fight our way out. And since we know what's in front of us, Sasuke observed. Shikamaru nodded. We charge straight forward. My kind of plan, came a tired and pained voice from nearby. Both teens turned to see Naruto holding himself with Choji's help. You're not leaving me out of this fight, he grumbled. I can help the team, Shikamaru shook his head. You're too out of it, and your seal is in the way. You just get ready to move the moment we have an opening, he ordered. Naruto glowered, still panting lightly as he recovered from the stinging assault on his ears. I said I'm fine. Hinata. Shikamaru barked. In an instant, the pale-eyed Hyuga arrived and, with just a moment's hesitation, knocked Naruto out with a soft touch to his nape. Shikamaru nodded. Thanks. Hinata merely looked away as she held up her unconscious crush. As much as it had pained her to knock him out, she also didn't want him to get hurt fighting while crippled. Are you done? The leader of the Odo teams asked, bored. Both of his teammates were overtly smirking, but this one just seemed bored to tears. Shikamaru frowned at the Odo genin, feeling as though he was being way too confident, despite their overwhelming numbers. Yes, Shikamaru and his friends were outnumbered practically 3-1, but at the same time, they had already proven to be superior to most of the Odo nin that had come after them. So why were they so confident now? Sakura, he took charge of the situation. You take Naruto and Bolt at the first opening we manage. Sasuke, you've got the guy who's blowing wind out of his hands. Hinata, you and Choji deal with Mummy Face. I'll deal with the girl. The first chance we get, we run after Sakura and Naruto. Understood? Sasuke snorted as he readied his kunai. Figures you'd go for the weak link. Shikamaru grinned weakly. What can I say? She seems the least troublesome. I will open a way for you. Hinata mumbled as she activated her Byakugan, reluctantly letting Sakura take Naruto from her. Please protect Naruto-kun. Sakura gave her a friendly grin. Leave it to me. Choji seemed nervous, shifting from foot to foot as he glanced at the Oto nin. They look strong, and I'm kinda hungry, but he glanced at Shikamaru, who remained cool despite the odds. He sighed, shook his head, slapped his cheeks, and steeled himself. Screw it. Let's do this. Shikamaru smiled in what he hoped was a confident fashion as he brought out a kunai and fixed his eyes on the dark-haired girl that was his target. If he was reading the Odo leader right, then the rest of the ambushers weren't there to swarm him and his friends, but rather to prevent them from escaping. Yet, given that Hinata had not noticed any trying to plug the hole left by the only overt Odo team, it meant they were confident that the Konoha genin would be unable to break through. Well, time to take a page out of Naruto's book and shatter all expectations. She did what? Kimiko didn't even react as Kakashi slammed a hand next to her head, leaning forward and glaring at her dangerously. The redhead had taken an incredible risk by disobeying her elders and going straight to Kakashi with this information, but, to paraphrase the future clan head, it was the right thing to do. The plan was to have the seal collapse right before the first test, Kimiko explained, not even a little bothered by the healthy amount of killing intent Kakashi was probably unconsciously letting out. Naruto-sama agreed to it. Naruto would agree to anything if he thought it made you guys happy. Kakashi snapped. This was reckless beyond belief. Kimiko glowered at him. The circumstances were dire. We had no choice if we wanted to bring Shuko-sama to Konoha. She defended her clan. She leaned to the side as Kakashi turned his head away in disgust, hoping to maintain eye contact to reinforce her sincerity. We had to. Why? He demanded. Fortunately, they were at his house, and no one had seen Kimiko enter. Between the privacy of his home and the many seals he'd purchased to have it soundproofed, there was no risk of being interrupted due to the noise they were making. So your clan can just add a couple dozen more clansmen to your numbers? Kimiko laughed bitterly. Try 300. Kakashi was stunned. What? Kimiko sighed as she raised a hand and palmed her face in frustration. Kakashi, it's more than just the numbers, she tried to explain. Honestly, if the older had ever come across a clansman so openly discussing clan matters, Kimiko had no doubt she would have killed everyone involved. Shuko-sama is a genius. No ifs, ands, or buts. Kakashi was still reeling from the understanding that there were at least 300 more Uzumaki clansmen out in the wild, and took a few steps back until he collapsed onto a chair. A genius, he managed to ask, shaking his head to get the shock out of his system. Kimiko crossed her arms under her bust and sighed. She's the reason there even is an Uzumaki clan left in this world, she explained. Keisuke-sama and Hayako-sama are both good leaders, but Shuko-sama is a strategist. The only reason we didn't all die at Yuzushiogakure was thanks to her. She stared at him, still hunched over and trying to absorb the fact that his student, his master's son, was out in the forest of death with maybe a tenth of his chakra available to him. And that there were at least 300 more Uzumaki somewhere in the elemental continent. She closed her eyes as she pondered her next words. When Yuzu's capital fell, Shuko-sama had been sick. Very sick. I wasn't around back then, but according to the stories, she was at death's door. That she recovered at all to coordinate the defense of our village was a miracle in itself. According to Keisuke-sama, the general consensus among the other elders had been to make a final stand, hoping against hope that our allies would show up in time. However, Shuko-sama was the one who perceived that we could not win, even if Konoha committed its entire strength towards relieving the siege. Kimiko continued, reminiscing back to the old stories the adults used to tell every now and then. So she ordered our evacuation in small groups. That's how we managed to slip out so many Uzumaki and avoided complete extermination. You're telling met his woman, Shuko, Kakashi slowly said as he lifted his head to look at Kimiko. It spoke to his level of consternation that he didn't even bother to register the fact that, with her arms crossed under her bust, Kimiko's assets were far more pronounced. The same woman who has now made it ridiculously easy to kill the one boy who can bring your family back together is the reason you are all alive? Kimiko gave him a weak grin. Ridiculous, right? That barely covers it, Kakashi grumbled as he rubbed his temple. A moment of silence passed between the two. We need to go to Hokage-sama with this, he said with finality. We can't. Kakashi glared at her with his one good eye. We have to, he insisted. We can't. Kimiko insisted right back. And why the hell not? Kakashi demanded, mentally wondering why he was even listening to this young woman in the first place. As a Jounin teacher of Konoha, he had the right to present this grievance to the Hokage without needing anyone else's prior approval. It was his team, they were his soldiers. Because, like it or not, Naruto-sama would be the one hurt the most, she pointed out, thankful Maki and Hikari had explained things to her. Keisuke had explained things as well, but like most elders, he was fond of overcomplicating things. Hikari and Maki, being used to dealing with idiocy the likes of Natsu and Takashi, were far more succinct. Silence. Explain. Kimiko sighed. If you go right now and complain to the Hokage, then maybe he stops the Chunin exams, she conceded. After all, some third parties unduly interfered in the proceedings and may have attacked the resident Jinchuriki. Kakashi nodded. So far, she'd expressed his side of things. She raised a finger then. But, she continued, what if he does? This exam, as I understand it, is exceptional in that it has managed to draw participants from IWA, Kiri, Oto, and Kumo, beyond the usual suspects from Kusa, Taki, and Suna. Kakashi's nod this time was slower. He had a feeling he knew where she was going with this, and if so, he didn't much like it. The foreign Kage are here because of what we did in Nami, she pointed out. Justifiably, they fear my clan has returned to wreak vengeance on those who nearly exterminated us. But more importantly, they're probably here to gauge our strength to see if we're as much a threat as our adventure in Nami suggests. Kakashi was silent. He could do the rest of the math himself. If Naruto, an Uzumaki, was at the core of a Chunin exam scandal that drew the whole process to a halt, then questions would arise regarding his deceased master's only child. Questions which could, in theory, lead to the discovery of his Jinchuriki status, the fact that he is Minato Namikaze's only son, or the fact that he is the nominal head of the Uzumaki clan, or all three. And if Kumo, IWA, and Kiri found out that not only had 3 Uzumaki been involved in the Nami incident, but that one of them was the future clan head, who at the same time was a Jinchuriki and the sole heir of the Yellow Flash, while at the same time having the ear of the Hokage, well, it would certainly help validate some false assumptions. Shuko-sama once told me, Kimiko suddenly said, having watched Kakashi think things through on his own, that information doesn't have to be true to have power, it just needs to sound true. Kakashi nodded. There was deeper wisdom in those words than seemed apparent. Even if the Hokage denied every accusation till Kingdom Come, the other great villages were not obliged to believe a word he said. Even if the Uzumaki were put under sanctions for their actions in Nami and himself as well by association, the other villages would have no reason not to believe the sanctions temporary or lenient. In short, unless he believed the Hokage was willing to deliver the heads of the entire Uzumaki clan to the other villages to keep the peace, then rocking the boat here by revealing Uzumaki Shuko's actions would be idiotic at best. Suicidal at worst, since there was no guarantee the Hokage wouldn't value the Uzumaki's military contributions enough to silence any dissenter. Kakashi placed his face in his palms and leaned down, groaning in frustration. This was the most stressed out he'd been in years, and he'd served in the fucking ANBU. You Uzumaki really know how to screw the pooch good, don't you? He mused bitterly. We didn't think Shuko-sama would target the clan head, Kimiko said defensively. Or that she'd be willing to stir trouble among the other villages just to screw Konoha over. Kakashi peeked over his hands at her. And you're positive Shuko had a hand in that? He asked. Honestly, the way Kimiko spoke of her, Shuko sounded like a Buddha of military strategy. It's the only explanation that makes sense, Kimiko opined. Kakashi groaned. What does she want, Kimiko? He asked. Kimiko was silent for a moment, clearly trying to find the right way to express herself. To be left alone, she answered simply. I'm not seeing the downside here. Kimiko sighed explosively, scowling at Kakashi. Kakashi, she snapped. Said Jounin grunted and waved her off. Yeah, he conceded. Truth was, he did see the downside to letting Shuko off to her own devices. A genius like her running wild in the elemental nations, with 300 unidentified shinobi at her beck and call, all of whom probably harbored as deep a grudge against the villages as their leader and the singular intent to cause as much devastating chaos as possible among their enemies. Yeah, not a pretty scenario to paint. So what do we do? He asked at length. Kimiko frowned. To be honest, I came to you to see if you had any bright ideas, she mentioned. Kakashi glanced at the wall clock in his apartment. He wasn't needed at the tower in the Forest of Death for another hour or so. It really was mostly ceremonial than anything. If the brats arrived with the 2 scrolls at some point after his shift began, the summoning formula on them would just make some other proctor on duty appear. Still, he wanted to be the one to congratulate them if they made it. Which reminded him he needed to change clothes. Shower, too. Couldn't show up in his nightwear, after all. You need to monitor Shuko, he told her, coming back to the topic at hand. Make sure she doesn't force us into an even deeper hole than we're in. If she tries to fudge with the exam anymore, stop her, he added as he got up and pulled his shirt over his head, leaving only his face mask on. I'll run interference as long as I can with the other jounin. Kimiko's eyes had widened fractionally at Kakashi's sudden state of undress, and quickly averted her gaze, much to his amusement. He'd completely forgotten that, behind the rough and vicious facade of the Uzumaki clan's enforcer still beat the heart of a maiden. Armed with this knowledge, Kakashi's eyes gleamed as he wondered how else he could fluster her. Despite his legendary self-control and overall lax attitude towards petty revenge, Kimiko had caused him no end of grief ever since they'd met, and this seemed like the right kind of payback. Seeing that she'd basically become frozen to the wall, Kakashi eyed her for a moment before shrugging and going for his pants. Shink. In a flash, a literal one, there was a sword stuck into his house's floor, blade right off his crotch. It somewhat depressed Kakashi to realize that this was hardly the first time he'd been in this sort of situation. What do you think you're doing? She hissed, blushing furiously. Getting ready to shower, he deadpanned. This is my house, remember? And since you ambushed me before I could get ready, I kinda need to get ready now. Kimiko blinked, having somehow completely forgotten that she was, in fact, intruding in his home very early in the morning and standing with a sword ready to split mini Kakashi in twain at the slightest flick of the blade, while said man was shirtless and had his hands ready to pull down his pants. When had she turned into Hikari? I'll be going now, she yelped in embarrassment before making the sword vanish and dashing out, leaving a bemused Kakashi behind. Arguably one of the most powerful Uzumaki clansmen, she at the sight of the male body. Who knew? Kakashi chuckled, despite the overall gravity of the situation. Once he got Naruto out of the mess he was mired in, he could see himself having a bit of fun at Kimiko's expense. First things first, however. He had a team to save. He paused. Somehow. Training Grounds 44, the Forest of Death, Chakra Restraining Seal dissipates in 3. 5 hours. Waking up half an hour later, Naruto's first cogent thought was that he had to find a way to pay back Shikamaru for getting him knocked out. His second thought was to immediately panic as the memory of their impending fight returned in full force. Instinctively rushing to his feet, Naruto looked around him to find himself very alone in what appeared to be a dark cave. That was his first warning sign. If he had been knocked out, then there was no way he'd gotten here without any help. That meant he should have someone else with him. So where was said person? On instinct, he summoned some chakra to be ready to throw out whatever jutsu he needed to fight off an enemy, then winced as he was reminded of his current chakra seal. Glowering at his wrist, he mentally reminded himself to ask Maki how to disable an active seal once he got out of this mess. In fact, in hindsight, it seemed downright irresponsible of him not to have done so in the first place. Walking to the mouth of the cave, he slowed his pace as he reached the dim sunlight outside, or whatever reached the ground after having been filtered by the thick canopy. It worried him that the only sounds he could make out were the resident wildlife, and none of it sounded remotely friendly. He made to shout, when he nearly kicked himself for being so reflexively dumb. Instead, he reached for his temporary communication seal and, using a chakra-charged finger, began tapping it in Morse code. Over and over he repeated his message, which was little more than a request for check-in. To his increasing worry, no answer came back, but he reminded himself that this was possible for various reasons. Perhaps his teammates were out of range, it was a temporary, basic communication seal, after all, or the ink had washed off, difficult, but possible, or they were unable to reply for one reason or another without necessarily meaning death. The problem was, that didn't help his situation at all. He had to get back to his friends, and finish this thrice-damned test, or else he would be responsible for holding them back. And that just pissed him off. Screw it, he grunted out loud as he rolled his shoulders and made a last attempt at communicating with Sakura and Shikamaru via their temporary tattoos. Looks like I'll have to look for them the hard way. We'd rather you didn't, yeah? Naruto immediately shot forward and rolled back onto his feet, smoothly turning on the spot as he did so, to see who had spoken. The voice had been unfamiliar, and he wasn't about to get cornered in a cave that would be suicide. Sitting atop the cave entrance in a lotus position, looking rather bored with everything, was a red-headed girl about his age he'd never seen before. For a moment, he let down his guard somewhat, given that it could just be another Uzumaki member he'd never gotten around to getting introduced to, until he spied her Hittite. Kusa. Naruto wasn't a boy blessed with the patience to pay much attention to history or politics, but he knew that Kusa's alliance with his village was tenuous at the best of times. Plus, given that his teammates were nowhere to be seen, he was unable to reach them, and this lone chick appeared to know where he'd been. Naruto had reason to be suspicious. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, pointing at her quite rudely. "Calm your ass down, alright," the girl answered dismissively, staring down at him through her rimmed glasses as though he was the greatest annoyance she'd had to deal with in her life. "Jun and Tetsu are out getting food. Last thing we need is for you to be a dumbass." Naruto twitched irritably at the dismissing tone. "Oi. I asked you a question," he shouted. The girl smirked at him. "And what makes you think you're in a position to ask them?" Glowering, Naruto's hands went for his kunai pouch, mentally sighing in relief that he still had a pouch on him, and quickly drew a kunai. "Answer me, damn it," he demanded. The girl's smirk grew wider, even as she remained still. "Make me," she dared. Not backing down, Naruto threw the kunai at the girl, hoping to scare her a bit by nicking her on the cheek. To his surprise, however, the kunai was deflected by the sudden appearance of a glowing chakra shield in front of her, making it bounce off harmlessly. In fact, all around him, chakra suddenly began to shimmer into solid existence, revealing he was caged in a fairly large, translucent chakra box. Just as quickly, the shimmering walls vanished. The girl laughed out loud at his dumbstruck look. "Not very smart, are you?" she asked as she calmed down. "You really think there's a dumbass on this earth that would just sit there and take a kunai to the head?" Naruto glowered, but was silently thankful that he'd at least tried. The appearance of the chakra barrier in front of the girl meant she'd taken precautions to avoid getting attacked, which in turn ruled out a frontal assault. Sure, he might have looked foolish for trying to hit her with a thrown kunai, but now he knew a bit more about what he was dealing with here. Plus, she hadn't moved yet from her spot, and if he was remembering his lessons right, that meant she was the one keeping him trapped in the invisible chakra cage. "What the hell do you want?" he demanded as he maintained a ready stance. She'd mentioned two names previously, and he wasn't eager to be jumped by her comrades. The girl's smirk seemed to be a fixed feature. "That's better," she crooned. "Starting to think first before you act. A little late to the party, but I guess even Keisuke-sama's vaunted future clan head isn't perfect." Naruto hoped he'd been able to reel in his visible shock, because the girl's words had just narrowed down his suspicions about her by a lot. "Yuri Uzumaki?" he asked hesitantly. Granted, he'd thought as much to begin with, but then dismissed the idea upon seeing her Hittite. The girl blew some errant lock of her red hair away from her face. "Still slow, huh?" she snarked before glancing up. "Hello? Red hair? Awesomeness incarnate? Of course I'm an Uzumaki, dumbass." Naruto's shock gave way to relief, completely ignoring the girl's rudeness. If she was an Uzumaki, then odds were she could help him get through this. If she could just take off his seal, then he could go back to his friends and help them out. Then, he shot out his sealed arm. "Can you take this seal off?" he asked urgently. "Nope." Naruto's shoulders slumped. "Damn. Maki-chan seals are that great, huh?" His head rose when he heard the girl snicker. "What's so funny?" he asked. The girl's smirk widened, and Naruto couldn't detect an ounce of friendliness in it. "You really are an idiot, aren't you?" she mused, making Naruto bristle slightly at the continuous insults. "It's not that I can't take away the seal, you moron, but that I won't." Naruto reeled. Here was an Uzumaki clansman, and they were refusing to help him. Why? Keisuke Jiji would have for sure told anyone participating in the exam to help him out, if he was in trouble. For that matter, why was she even in this exam? As far as he could remember, the elders hadn't told him of any Uzumaki candidates. And why was she wearing a Kusa Hittite, damn it? All of these questions made Naruto's frustration skyrocket, until, in one burst of anger, he vocalized it in the most succinct way he knew. Why the hell not, damn it? Shuko-sama's orders. And just like that, Naruto's anger vanished, replaced with a cold chill in his veins. Shuko. The furtive elder that he'd never met, yet had steadfastly refused to acknowledge him as future clan head, thereby keeping their family apart. Everyone he'd spoken to insisted she had her reasons, and that she was incredibly smart, but Naruto had never really understood any of that. Except now things were beginning to click. The seal on his arm, the seal that should have disappeared by now. Shuko did this to me, didn't she? Naruto asked as he looked down at the seal on his wrist. Yep, the girl confirmed. Why? The girl shrugged. Who knows? With Shuko-sama, it's anyone's guess. Does she want me dead? Naruto asked remarkably calmly. Doubt it, the girl answered. Why not? The girl smirked again. 'Cause my team and I are here. Naruto blinked. She'd lost him. Huh? The red-headed girl sighed. I can see why she'd think less of you, she said wearily, rolling her eyes. Kinda slow on the uptake there, aren't ya? Oi. The girl ignored him. Look, my team and I are here to monitor you, she explained. And to interfere if you were in danger, or if you were about to pass the test. Naruto nodded, following so far. One thing did bug him, though, beside the fact that someone was actively sabotaging him and his team. That is, won't Shuko get mad at you for telling me this? He asked. Keisuke and Hayako, as well as his other clan teachers, had all taught him the value of never revealing too much information to an unknown actor. The girl, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. Why? Anyone with two brain cells to rub together could figure it out. Naruto growled. She just would not stop with the digs at his intelligence. Sure, he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but that didn't mean he was an idiot, damn it. Are you the reason why we haven't found any Earth Scrolls? He asked her bluntly. However irritated he was feeling, he needed answers, and the longer she was focused on answering him, the longer he had to think of a way out of this. The girl smirked. Like that? She asking tauntingly. All it took was a couple of changes to the scroll's appearance, and that was that. A few seals applied discreetly before the test began, and bam. Instant heaven scrolls. On the outside, anyway. Naruto's inner prankster couldn't help but feel impressed. Given that the participants had explicit instructions not to open their scrolls, there was no way of telling whether or not a heaven scroll was genuine or not until they reached the tower, and if they got it wrong, they could be failed. And if anyone tried to verify its authenticity before the test ended, the scroll's security measures would knock them out for the duration of the test. Brilliant. Dastardly, sure, but brilliant. He was even willing to bet that extra heaven scrolls they'd come across already had reverted back to Earth scrolls once he and his team were out of the way. It's what he'd have done to avoid raising suspicions among the proctors. What about my team? He asked. He still had no idea where his missing teammates were, and he wasn't about to throw them under the metaphorical bus. The girl shrugged disinterestedly. If you mean Pinky, June took her to a safe spot. She'll wake up having regrettably failed the exams, but safe. And the others? Naruto pressed, despite being relieved to know that Sakura was alright. Shikamaru and the others were about to fight off 15 Odo assholes. The girl shrugged again. Not our problem. They live. They die, pity that. Okay, now Naruto was getting seriously pissed. The intelligence jokes, he'd lived through worse at school. The isolation from his friends, he could deal with that too, given that he'd gotten out of worse scrapes. He was even fine with knowing someone was dicking around with his life, he was used to that as well. But being so cavalier about his friends' lives? Fuck. That. Shit. He quickly ran through what he knew about barrier seals, the only possible explanation for why the girl had settled for taunting him from her sitting position. He knew they needed to be maintained by a caster the girl, and its strength was proportionate to the complexity of the seal, which he currently did not know. According to Maki's lessons, seals were only good as long as the initial sealing formula was left intact. It was one of the reasons Kimiko had to retouch her seals after every fight, or else her body seals would go haywire and potentially rip her apart from the inside. Similarly, a barrier seal would only be active so long as these initial seals were left intact. A single blemish, a single scrape, and the entire thing collapsed. Thus, while seal barriers were among the most powerful in existence, they were also critically vulnerable in this one aspect. The problem was, he had a fair idea about where the seal array was located, and that was right underneath the sitting girl, who was in turn protected by a smaller version of the barrier she was using to keep him locked in this area. "Let me out," he ordered her, walking towards where he'd seen the edge of the barrier shimmer before. "I need to save my friends." The girl snorted. "With what?" "Your stellar personality and some angry language," she asked dismissively. "You forget, we've been monitoring you. That chakra seal is keeping you from accessing most of your chakra, about 95%, by my calculations. Your taijutsu is basically passable, but not overwhelming or effective against large groups, and your sealing knowledge is based solely on the slips of paper that Maki-chan gave you." The girl took a deep breath and then shrugged. "Face it. Your scree," whatever she was going to say died in her throat as Naruto punched the edge of the barrier, making it shimmer briefly, but remain intact. A moment of silence passed between them before the girl recovered from shock. "What the, are you a complete dumbass or something?" she demanded, managing to stay sitting despite her anger. "This is a level 4 barrier seal," she reprimanded him. "You're more liable to break your idiot hand than it is to budge." Wham! Again, Naruto smashed his fist against the barrier, and again it refused to break. The girl could only gape at the astounding amount of idiocy being displayed here. "Holy crap," she muttered disbelievingly. "This is the future clan head? No wonder Shuko-sama wants nothing to do with you." Wham! Naruto's third punch was similarly ineffective, but rather than ready a fourth punch, Naruto turned to face his captor, a potentially suicidal idea coming to mind. "Shuko is a coward." Silence. "You have 5 seconds to apologize before I make up a story about how you tragically died before we could save you, punk," the girl threatened as her visage twisted into the perfect image of fury. Now it was his turn to smile tauntingly. "Shuko is a coward," he repeated slowly. The girl's eyes narrowed into a deep, furious glare. "You little," her entire frame was trembling, as her self-control battled with her raging emotions. Eventually, however, her temper could hold out no more, and she shot to her feet. "Fuck," she screamed angrily, the entire barrier lighting up like the sun, before the sound of glass breaking filled the clearing. As she belatedly realized what had happened, the girl and Naruto watched as the clearing was lit up by the now visible barrier, before it shattered into nothingness. There was a pregnant pause then, as both Naruto and the girl realized he was now free. "Oh, shit." Without a moment's delay, Naruto shot her a triumphant grin, and then vanished from sight. For the first time ever, he could not be more glad for the infamous Uzumaki temper. In hindsight, Karen realized that perhaps putting her in charge of the prisoner had been a bad idea. Shuko had always encouraged self-reflection among her clansmen, and Karen had often come to the conclusion that she was, much like many of her clan, incredibly hot-headed. The trigger for the famous Uzumaki temper, of course, wasn't universal. Some people, like herself, got pissed off when their heroes or families were insulted or harmed. Others, like Isamu, were much colder. Their triggers were much less obvious, and they were capable of greater restraint. As a result, they were also the ones trusted the most by Shuko for critical assignments that demanded stealth and subtlety. In her team, that person was June. Shuko-sama will be displeased, June noted as they raced after the fleeing Naruto. He and Tetsu had been on their way back to the camp, having left the Haruno girl near the tower, when they'd received Karen's burst transmission through their seals that Naruto had escaped. Karen predictably winced at June's rather bland reprimand. It was the closest June ever seemed to get to yelling his head off. Yeah, Karen, what the hell? Tetsu, on the other hand, was far less cool-headed. How'd a brat get through a level 4 barrier seal? He provoked me. Karen shot back a bit lamely. Truth be told, it wasn't a great excuse, and her teammates' expressions told her they weren't the least impressed. Perhaps I should have remained with the prisoner after all, June mused aloud as he jumped to the next tree branch. Karen dipped her head in embarrassment. She had held such high expectations regarding her first foray into carrying out missions for Shuko. Most clansmen her age were usually still in training, or relegated to support roles far away from the actual mission. That she had been picked for this mission at all had been remarkable, and not a small source of pride for her. Of course, the reason for her presence was obvious. June and Tetsu were both a little too skilled to be believed to be genin. However, Karen was both the right age, and had the right amount of skill, for anyone to believe she was a rookie. Even the level 4 barrier seal had been June's work. All she'd had to do was sit still and fuel the barrier with her not insubstantial chakra reserves. Like a battery. A battery that had failed its purpose. What happened, June said then, landing on another branch and taking note of something on it. We are close. He appears to be moving directly towards our last reported sighting of the Otonin and Konohanin conflict. Karen grit her teeth. Of course he was. Stubborn and predictable as a mule, that clan head candidate. She couldn't wait to get her hands on him and beat him within an inch of his life for humiliating her. Of course, it would have been even cooler if she could manipulate her chakra to create the infamous Congo Fusa, or adamantine sealing chains. June was capable of it. Tetsu wasn't. So, what's the plan, boss man? Tetsu asked, his savage grin splitting his face. Unlike Karen, he seemed to have a good idea what their team leader had in mind. We reacquire the target, June replied coolly. Willingly, if possible. And if he resists? Karen asked. Insist. Karen shivered from the way June had emphasized his reply. She had no doubts that if Naruto showed any sort of resistance, June would not hesitate to break a bone or two to ensure his cooperation. To clansmen like June, Shuko's orders were absolute, and there was no changing their minds. There he is. Tetsu cried with a triumphant grin, pointing towards the gray and black figure jumping branches ahead of them. Karen smiled as well. It was inevitable, really. With his chakra seal in place, every jump would wear down on his reserves and stamina, while her team was raring to go. I've got him, June announced simply, and with a mere twitch of his eyes, for chakra chains burst out from his back, turning in mid-air and shooting towards Naruto. The blonde barely had the chance to turn his head to see what was going on before the chains were upon him. To their surprise, however, Naruto reacted quickly, dodging the initial salvo of chakra chains and speeding up, though they could see this was straining his already minimal chakra reserves. The chakra chains, for their part, wedged themselves in a nearby tree. Slippery little sod, Tetsu noted with a savage grin. June nodded, before frowning. But ultimately useless, he said, right before he disappeared from Karen's side. Karen had to adjust her bearings a bit before she realized June was using the chakra chains to pull himself forward. Karen winced as she saw June suddenly overtake Naruto and spear tackle him down towards the ground. Tetsu and she quickly caught up, but by then, June had managed to subdue the blonde. Let me go. Naruto demanded as he futilely continued to struggle. Please cease your resistance, Naruto-san, Jun said neutrally as he kept the blonde's arms pinned on his back, the other hand holding down his head. I would rather not have to take drastic measures to ensure your cooperation. Jun then looked up at his teammates. Tetsu, set up a perimeter. Karen-kun, please bind Naruto-san's limbs securely. Let me go, damn it. Naruto continued to howl. I won't abandon my friends. Their fate is outside your power to affect, Naruto-san, Jun said calmly as he effortlessly held him down. Not only have you not the skill to turn the tides of their struggle, you have had most of your chakra sealed away, including your remarkable condition. Naruto froze for an instant, having apparently deduced that they knew he was a Jinchuriki. Karen took advantage of that moment of indecision to bind his wrists. How do you know? He asked. Jun ignored the huff of condescending pride from Karen. We are intelligence gatherers, Naruto-san. It is only logical we would piece everything together, he explained. Karen frowned as she noticed that, despite his earlier struggle, Naruto was seemingly calming down. That was highly unusual, given the boy's desperate attempts to escape previously. What was he planning this time? Jun-senpai, she started, only to be halted as the man raised a hand. I am aware, Karen-san, he said calmly, still holding Naruto down. The Uzumaki tracker's gaze was turned to meet Naruto's own. If your intent to escape now involves convincing us of the righteousness of your cause, Naruto-san, I wouldn't bother. Shuko-sama's orders are absolute. Naruto chuckled grimly. Yeah, I figured, he acknowledged. I got that feeling from Ceiling Girl, there. Karen twitched. Technically, the barrier seal had been Jun's work, not hers. Then you have decided to surrender and cooperate? Jun asked, not once relieving the pressure he was applying to Naruto's wrists. Never, Naruto said with such conviction as to momentarily make Karen stumble in surprise. Even if you break every bone in my body, I would just crawl away next time. Jun nodded silently and then proceeded to dislocate one of Naruto's wrists. Karen flinched at Naruto's howl of pain, while Jun seemed entirely unaffected by it. You are worthy of respect, Naruto-san, Jun said calmly, seemingly ignoring the fact that he had just caused the future clan head of the Uzumaki enormous amounts of pain. Your strength of conviction, worthy of praise. But conviction is useless in the face of superior strategy and power. Fuck you. Naruto gasped through the pain. Jun ignored the insult. Are you aware, Naruto-san, of the reason we are to detain you, not kill you? He asked. Naruto's expression clearly said he'd much rather get the older Uzumaki right now, but the pain was clearly too much for him to vocalize anything. Shuko-sama is not heartless, Jun informed his prisoner, nodding to Karen to proceed with binding his ankles. Though it would have served our goals better to see you dead, Naruto-san, you are still of our blood, he added. And Shuko-sama has no wish to spill Uzumaki blood. Then join us, ye fucking morons. Naruto hissed through gritted teeth. We cannot, Jun said calmly. You would have us join hands with our enemy, Naruto-san. To forgive the unforgivable. Kanahanat Kiri. Naruto spat. Jun eyed him askance. And what makes you think Kiri is the one we want revenge on? Naruto stared at Jun in silence, dawning horror creeping onto his face. Jun stared up, towards where he could hear the sounds of a battle coming closer. Likely the Konohanin and Otonin. He didn't worry, however Tetsu was on perimeter guard, so if anyone came close enough to become a problem, he would let Jun know. Iwa, Kiri, Kumo, Jun then continued. The three great villages who laid waste to Yuzu and Yuzushiogakure. It is natural that, like many of our clansmen here, you would think we would want them to pay. Jun then glanced at Karen, who nodded, having finished binding Naruto's limbs. Finally, Jun dropped the pressure he applied to Naruto's aching wrist. But theirs is a crime of fear, and strategically understandable. Konoha's sin, however, is one of craven cowardice. Naruto glared at June, who was finally standing up. He had that look of self-righteousness that always made Naruto want to punch his old academy teachers Irika excluded in the face. You bastards! June's gaze was upon him, silently telling him that he had lost completely. For the sin of abandoning their allies, Konoha will lose the Uzumaki, and gain the ire of the great nations. Like hell they will. June and Karen had barely the time to react when a sudden transmission through their seals from Tetsu warned them of what was to come. A single kunai, a seal tag attached to it, landed firmly next to them, prompting Karen and June to jump out of the way, in case it was an exploding tag. Instead, it unleashed a large cloud of smoke that instantly obscured their view of Naruto, prompting Karen to swear loudly. Damn it, she cursed. Who did that? June, for his part, remained calm, eyeing his Uzumaki tattoo on his shoulder. It would seem there is someone competent among Naruto-san's teammates, he observed as he made a quick seal and blew away the smoke. We have been ambushed. Standing all around them atop of branches was a group of 3 worn, but defiant Konohanin. Their leader, a wild-looking teen with red markings on his cheeks and a puppy at his side, was glowering down at them, while a blonde teenage girl undid Naruto's bindings. A third teen, whose expression was hidden by a high-collared jacket and large, dark glasses, stood silently by. Looks like you've been taking care of our friend for us, Kiba growled, cracking his knuckles audibly. We'd like to repay the favor. Ino nodded as she reset Naruto's wrist with a pop, causing the boy to whimper in pain. She turned to glower at the 3 Kusanin who'd boldly announced they would bring Konoha down. You hurt our friend and threaten our village, she said angrily, drawing a kunai. You're going down. Then, a buzzing sound started to permeate the air, and June and Karen noticed that there seemed to be a sudden increase in the presence of bugs around them. Karen saw that neither the first boy or the girl seemed to be controlling them, leaving the third one as the likely culprit. Konoha values its bonds, Shino said, even as the buzzing sound increased. Why? Because we value our friends. Kiba sneered, bumping his fists together with some strength, while his puppy barked angrily at the 2 Kusanin. Team Kiba, engage. Kiba sneered, bumping his fists together with some strength, while his puppy barked angrily at the 2 Kusanin. Team Kiba, engage. Withdraw. Kiba and his team froze in place as the red-headed young man on the ground simply turned away, his similarly red-headed female companion following shortly after. What was going on? Was this a trap? Why were the red-headed Kusanin abandoning their prey so easily? Tetsu, that means you, too. Kiba's senses suddenly screamed danger, and quickly turned around, ready to defend his team, when he suddenly noticed someone towering above them, the most savage grin he'd ever seen adorning the beast's face. Oughtn't I break one, June? The beast man called Tetsu said longingly. They look suffragal. For once, Kiba's voice failed to vocalize his defiance, as his quasi-animalistic instinct screamed danger at him. The look in the young man's face wasn't normal. It was the look of someone who enjoyed destroying people. We have our orders, the one called June said calmly. Kiba afforded a glance back, and saw that even the girl seemed uneasy about the situation. We are not to harm any of the Konohanin referred to as the Rookie 9. Ah, Tetsu whined, before grinning down at Kiba. Lucky day, brat, he added, before disappearing in a flash, only to reappear by June's side. Said stoic redhead merely stared at Naruto, who was still lying down on the branch, nursing his fixed wrist. For a moment, Kiba thought the redhead might make a move after all, before he turned away again, flanked by his own companions. We will concede this engagement, Konohanin, he announced aloud. Naruto-san. If you wish to know more about the truth of your family, I would suggest you seek her out. You might find your current allegiances a little harder to stomach, then. Oi! Kiba shouted as the 3 redheads vanished. Kiba, leave them be, Shino stopped his teammate. That was high-level Shunshin. We are not at their level. Ino swallowed and nodded, still shaking from the encounter with the one called Tetsu. She hadn't even realized he had snuck up on them, and she was supposed to be a member of a family of censors. Then again, neither had Kiba, and his sense of smell was unparalleled. He's right, Naruto grumbled as he got to his feet, still avoiding putting pressure on his aching wrist. June had gotten him good, he was willing to admit, but the fact that it had been a mere displacement, rather than a clean break, had told him that Karen's assertion that they were here to restrain him and protect him, not hurt him, was probably true. Which meant June's assertion that they were not to harm the Rookie Nine, he had no idea they were even called that, was also likely true. The only one in that group who's a genin is the girl, he told them. The other two are way stronger. Naruto's voice snapped Kiba out of his momentary paralysis, prompting him to glare at his friend. Oi, what's that supposed to mean? He demanded. Why would Kusa cheat like that? Naruto didn't answer, unwilling, despite what they'd done to him, to incriminate his family in this mess. Moreover, he didn't know if Kiba, Shino, or Ino would understand the way his family was divided, or the complicated mess that had arisen as a result of their homeland's destruction. They are not from Kusa, are they? Shino asked calmly. Naruto flinched. Ino said. Why would they be wearing Kusa headbands, then? Likely to throw us off, Shino answered. Why? Because their goal appears to be to cause a massive war between the villages. What better way to do that than to cause one of Konoha's alliances to dissolve? Kiba narrowed his eyes. He didn't like subtle bullshit like that. He'd much rather the enemy came head-on, no matter the odds, and go down fighting like a real man. All this cloak and dagger shit really got on his nerves. Naruto Dino spoke up then, looking around. Where's the rest of your team? Naruto looked further into the forest. The sound of fighting had died down a bit. He didn't know whether or not that was good, but couldn't afford to lose hope right now. We were ambushed by Otonin, he said. Igit separated from the rest. Sakura-chan too. She should be near the tower, though. Shino pushed up his glasses, a stray beam of sunlight causing it to briefly flash. These fake Kusa-nin are the reason Sakura-san and yourself were separated from the rest, aren't they? Naruto sweat a bit at Shino's observation. Damn that guy and his perceptiveness. Yeah. Kiba frowned at Naruto, still remembering he needed to sock his friend one for all the crap he'd put them through the past few weeks, but decided this wasn't the time or place. Instead, he turned around and began sniffing the air, Akamaru following suit. The dog got there before he did, however, and barked anxiously. Akamaru's got their scent, Kiba announced, translating for his Nin-ken. They're moving all over the place, followed by a bunch of unfamiliar scents. Naruto growled. The Otonin. He eyed his temporary communication tattoo, but decided against contacting Shikamaru at this time. He didn't know what his friend's circumstances were, and if he inadvertently distracted him at a potentially fatal time, he would never forgive himself. We need to go help them. Ino exclaimed. Agreed, Shino weighed in. Kiba smirked, bumping fists together, while Akamaru barked in agreement. Of course we're going. Konoha never leaves its comrades hanging. None of them noticed Naruto's flinch. Shikamaru was having a rather bad day. Now, as a rule, that could mean anything from having to study for a test to World War IV. Except, with the events of the past few weeks taken into perspective, he figured it was about time he revised his categorization of a bad day. Under this new revision, tests were now troublesome, while World War IV was catastrophic. Bad was what he was facing now. A mob of Otonins aiming to kill him and his friends. Of course, the initial confrontation had gone pretty much as he'd envisioned. Once Sakura and Naruto had made their escape, or rather, once Sakura had carried the unconscious Naruto off, the Otonin had tried to stop them, allowing Choji and Sasuke to launch a surprise attack that held off the Otonin's pursuit. The problem was what came after. Once Sakura and Naruto, arguably the weakest members of their group right now, had gone, the Otonin had turned their attentions back to the remaining 4 Konoha shinobi. Of course, being that only 3 had deigned to actually step up to fight, that should have meant a quick victory. Except that the moment one of the Otonin looked about ready to fall, another jumped in and took their place. Then the wounded Otonin would get out of the way, only to return later, when their wounds were healed. Which meant the presence of a medic nin. Definitely not genin level. If it weren't for the fact that they were aiming to kill him, Shikamaru might have actually admired the plan. Without needing their forces to sacrifice their lives for the sake of taking down one of the Konoha rookies, the Otonin were nonetheless able to whittle down their stamina and fighting abilities through sheer attrition. Which suddenly tilted the odds way in their favor, considering they had at least 15 shinobi on their side, while he had to plan with 4, including himself. Shikamaru, Sasuke spoke up at his side, breathing heavily. Honestly, the raven-haired Uchiha survivor had done well to last this long, even if the quality of the enemy genin was subpar. His outfit had numerous tears all over, and quite a few cuts, though none impairing. Yeah, Shikamaru acknowledged, wiping away some sweat from his larger-than-average forehead with his sleeve. There wasn't a member of the remaining Konoha nin who didn't look worse for wear right now. Hinata, surprisingly, had the second highest stamina, a little out of breath, like Sasuke, but otherwise still battle-capable. Choji was only marginally better than he was, on the other hand, and the poor, rotund boy had begun to slow down with his attacks. Thousands of scenarios and careful calculations flashed through Shikamaru's mind, even as the Otonin began another offensive. Each scenario he considered carefully, outlining steps and contingencies. Before the Otonin had moved even halfway forward towards them, Shikamaru had already processed over 200 possible scenarios. All of them ended in defeat. He had considered escape, but it was impossible without leaving someone behind as a sacrificial pawn. He had considered breaking through by force, only to rationally deduce that the remaining Otonin wouldn't just stand by, and would instead seek to trap them. From the way they were particularly focused on taking out Sasuke, any attempts to escape would necessitate his abandonment. And abandoning allies was one thing he could not countenance. He blamed Naruto for that. Stupid blonde and his infectious, stupid sense of honor. He hadn't even realized he was smirking until Choji pointed it out. What's so funny, Shika? Shikamaru sighed, almost resigned by now to the fact that he was going to die in this troublesome forest, surrounded by troublesome friends, at the hands of troublesome foreign ninjas with a secretive agenda. Just thinking what Naruto would do in this situation. He half expected Sasuke to make a crack at Naruto's expense, but instead all he got was a surprising grunt in agreement. Dobe always did know how to get his ass out of a slippery situation, the usually acerbic Uchiha agreed grudgingly. Hinata smiled, despite the growing numbness of her muscles as she remained in her stance. She was pushing herself past her limits, and would soon be restricted to fighting with nothing more than her raw, physical strength, which she did not have in abundance. Naruto-kun would fight to the end, she said with all the conviction she could muster. Yeah, he's dumb like that, Choji agreed with a chuckle. Shikamaru chuckled exasperatedly. I guess that makes us dumb, too, he mused as he watched the Otonin charge forward. The Otonin crashed into their midst as they had before. They weren't trying to be clever, or even all that cunning. All they sought to do was to force them to fight physically for as long as possible, before retreating. To that end, Shikamaru was forced, time and time again, to abandon his shadow techniques in favor of a kunai. Every time he attempted to hold one of them down, the other two would switch their attention to him. If he ever managed to get all 3, a hail of kunai from the other Otonin would force him to let go, beginning the cycle all over again. Gritting his teeth, he kept the Otonin at bay with his kunai, peripherally noting that Sasuke and Hinata had chosen to fight this time, giving Choji the chance to breathe. By his calculations, he would be the next one taking a break, followed by Hinata, then Choji again, then Sasuke, then himself, and then they were all dead. "We need a miracle," he muttered under his breath as he parried another blow. It had been closer than the others, and Shikamaru could see the number of possible outcomes slowly dwindle. The Otonin in front of him, whose eyes were bandaged, shot him a sick grin. "Ain't no miracles coming to save your ass, you Konoha treefuckers," he cackled. Shikamaru knew he was right, even as an errant bug flew into his field of vision. Miracles were the object of fantasy. In reality, what often came across as miracles was merely the convergence of 1,000 different actions and factors that no one had seen coming. In the absence of information, everything looked like magic. But damn if it didn't make your heart soar when it happened. He had to restrain a throaty chuckle as he realized what he'd been missing. What the Otonin had missed entirely. They weren't the Rookie 6. They were the Rookie 9. "What the fuck is it with these bugs?" the Otonin attacking him cried out as he abandoned attacking Shikamaru in favor of swatting them away. Similarly beset upon by the bugs, the other two attacking Otonin cried out helplessly as the swarm intensified and began to suck away at their chakra. Hinata laughed in disbelieving relief. Sasuke gave a tired smirk. Choji fell on his ass, his smile speaking volumes. And Shikamaru bent over to take a breath, then looked up with a knowing smile. "It's about damn time you got your ass back here, Naruto." A single figure landed among the panicking Otonin and proceeded to dispatch them with well-practiced Hakushoken strikes. As the swarm of bugs dispersed, their job done, Naruto stood there, looking strangely grim, yet ready to fight. "You guys all right?" he asked. Sasuke swallowed hard before nodding, while Shikamaru and Choji gave rather more tired nods. Hinata, for her part, seemed to be standing based solely on willpower right now, but the look on her face told Naruto there would be no way to get her to back down. Shocked shouting broke out all around them, prompting a smirk from Naruto. "That'd be Kiba and Shino," he remarked. "Ino's keeping an eye out for any other Otonins coming our way." He looked back at his friends. "Come on. We need to lose them before they recover." Sasuke shot Shikamaru a questioning look, which he answered with a shrug. Right now, he had no plans. He needed information and time to formulate a strategy. Retreating was, in the end, their best option. "Lead the way." Jun and his team watched as the Konoha Nin fled the scene of battle, the sudden arrival of 4 more comrades managing to cause quite a bit of disarray among the Odo ranks. "Shuko-sama is going to be so pissed," Karen was whining, holding her head in her hands. "Doubtful," Jun observed calmly. "We completed our orders to the letter. We intervened to save Naruto-san, and though he escaped, he fled back to his allies, and is thus in no extraordinary danger." TCH, the monster man known as Tetsu vocalized. "I still think I could have crushed a few of them to make things more fun. Alienating the clan from the rest of Konoha's great houses is not our directive," Jun retorted coldly. "Such a course of action would have made obtaining Naruto-san's cooperation even more difficult." "What, like dislocating his freaking wrist?" Karen observed snidely. Jun shrugged. "An unfortunate decision, which had to be taken in light of our then circumstances," he said. "Had he agreed to be taken to safety, I would not have needed to do so. In the end, his comrade was able to help him, no?" Tetsu laughed, while Karen sighed into her hands. "The ridiculous thing here is, you actually think Naruto's going to let this go that easily?" Jun blinked. "Will he not?" Karen sighed again, while Tetsu's laugh just increased in intensity. None of them reacted when 6 Otonins jumped into view and surrounded them, their beat-up appearance informing them they had participated in the assault on the Konoha Genin. "Who the hell are you?" one of them cried out. "Surrender, or die," cried another. Karen paid them no heed. "Should we keep messing with the scrolls, then?" she asked Jun. The lead Otonin glowered at her, and raised his kunai. "Don't ignore me," he howled, ready to stab her in the throat. The kunai never got there. Nor did his arm. Instead, a spray of arterial blood showered the Otonin standing next to him. No, June answered, ignoring the Otonin as he fell to his knees, howling in pain. This situation with the Oto Shinobi should be reported to Shuko-sama, and we will thereafter continue our monitoring. You fuckers, another Otonin shouted as they charged. Neither June nor Karen made a move. Instead, the older of the duo just stared at them blankly. Tetsu. The Oto Shinobi only belatedly realized something they had crucially missed, what with the sudden loss of their fellow shinobi's arm. The third member of this mysterious group of Kusanin was gone. An animalistic howl from above caught their attention, just before two of the Oto Shinobi had their heads caved in. Before the rest could react, the creature was among them, its large fists hitting out and crushing bone with every impact. He's a Goken user, one of them cried out. Quick, seal his move, he ordered, right before his ribcage collapsed and punctured his lungs fatally with one blow. The two junior members of the Oto strike team were frozen in fear as the monster tore through their teammates. Before they knew it, the creature was towering over them, its long, red mane of hair accentuating the deadly grin on his face and the blood splatter on his GI. What's wrong? He asked tauntingly. Just gonna stand there, pansies? The female Otonin stuttered, her eyes wide with horror. The kunai in her hand was shaking so hard, it was a miracle she could keep a grip on it. Monster. Said Monster's grin simply widened at the accusation, and casually gripped both remaining Oto Shinobi by the neck without resistance. With his bulging musculature, these teenagers might as well have weighed the same as two of his Easy Day dumbbells. Curse the day you decided to become shinobi, he said, still grinning. At that moment, the two remaining members of the Oto detachment looked to the other male Kusanin. He had his head bowed and his right hand raised in some odd gesture. A glance at the girl showed she was in the same posture. May you find peace upon the shining path, June intoned. A final attempt to scream was ended when Tetsu crushed their throats, his large hands collapsing their trachea and snapping their neck in a single motion. Their lives ended. The large Uzumaki warrior let the bodies drop towards the ground below, completely uncaring if their bodies were broken even more in the fall. Dead was dead. The dead could not protest. Oh, damn it, Tetsu. Karen whined as she checked her clothing. You got some blood on me. Tetsu shrugged as he made a show of dusting his hands, which were still covered in Oto blood. They were squishy. These genin are no challenge at all, he complained to June, who shrugged. I should hope not, June remarked. As Uzumaki jounin, it would be most distressing if mere genin were a match for us. Karen huffed as she got to her feet. Speak for yourselves, she complained. I'm still a genin. June ignored her. They are moving quite fast, he observed. We must hasten if we are to keep track of them, since Karen-san's sensory ability is still undeveloped. Karen flinched at the backhanded reprimand, but consoled herself with the knowledge that, at her age, very few genin even had a sensory ability. The Uzumaki clan just happened to have far more demanding expectations. What if we run into more of those Oto pukes? Tetsu asked with an unhinged grin. June shrugged, while Karen sighed in exasperation. She was definitely going to need a change of clothes by the time this event was over. Do with them as you wish, June replied simply. Our target is Naruto-san. Make sure not to lose him, but be sure to stay out of range of the Hyuga's eyes, he ordered his team. He then swept his arm in the general direction the Konoha genin had taken. Move out. Hi. Konohagakure, 2 hours until the chakra seal dissipates. Shuko eyed the arguing group of shinobi with a wary eye, still in her child form. She had arbitrarily decided that she wanted to go out for a walk, and had roped Tashiko into her decision. The younger Uzumaki clansman was now acting like Shuko's older sister, given the clan elder's child form, and she was doing a good job of pretending to be anxious about the group of Suna and Kiri Nin who appeared to be one wrong shove away from drawing weapons. Fortunately for the actually anxious innocent bystanders, the argument was promptly dissolved by the appearance of ANBU operatives, who calmly ordered them to disperse. "That's the fifth fight today," one of the masked operatives muttered under his breath, though not softly enough to prevent Shuko and Tashiko from hearing him, right before he disappeared from sight. The duo casually made their way towards a nearby park, where they took a seat on a bench as they enjoyed some ice cream. Yet, both of their minds were on the argument they'd just seen. "The fights are increasing in frequency," Tashiko noted. Shuko nodded, but just kept licking her ice cream. "This does not concern you, Shuko-sama?" she asked. The clan elder stopped, mid-lick, and shot her favorite clansman a look. Tashiko, despite her favored status, immediately understood her mistake and blushed in embarrassment as she looked away. "Apologies. AI-chan," she corrected herself. Shuko nodded as she turned back to her ice cream. Ever since they had arrived in Konoha, she had made sure that the only people who knew she was here were her own clansmen. She harbored no expectations that anyone else would recognize her name offhandedly, but given that the sitting Hokage and Keisuke seemed amiable towards each other, there was no discounting that her name might have been made known. Which was, of course, why another clansman of hers was now running Konoha around using the name Shuko, while the elder herself used the much more unassuming name, AI. The thing was, Tashiko wasn't wrong when she asked her if the fights concerned her. They did. Though she held absolutely no love for any of the great villages, Shuko had a plan going on right now, and the last thing she needed was some amateur stumbling into her path. And amateurish it certainly was. Inciting fights between the different shinobi factions while a Gakage summit is underway? Oldest trick in the book and not very effective, if one knew what to look for. Like that shifty IWA mean she'd spotted a couple of days ago. It was most concerning that Takeru and Yukimaru had failed to produce any solid results. According to their report, the IWA Nin had simply vanished after the altercation. Any attempts to track him down had met with failure. It had been one of the reasons she had wanted to make that map of Konoha as quickly as possible. There was something in the air that was bugging her, and she didn't quite like the feeling of it. The last time she'd felt this way, she'd been on her deathbed in Yuzu, and a grand alliance was coming to destroy her homeland. "Tashiko-ne," she spoke up, her ice cream could wait. Even if it was quite good. "Yes, AI-chan? We should invite our NII-chans to come and visit this place," she said innocently with a grin. "The forests outside the wall are really pretty." Tashiko's gaze sharpened for an instant before returning to normal. She smiled and nodded as she patted Shuko on the head. "You're right. We should. I'm sure our NII-sans would appreciate a walk in the forest." Shuko grinned and nodded fervently. And, if they find something cool, they should totally tell us, so we can go together next time." Tashiko smiled and nodded. "That's right, AI-chan. As a family." Shuko nodded excitedly before turning to her ice cream, keeping up with the small child routine. Her thoughts, however, turned to her plan. It would need revisions, that was for sure. This third party's amateurish blundering was causing the international political situation to worsen with each passing day. Of course, their objective was as clear as day: a war. Someone was dumb enough to try to start the Fourth Shinobi World War. Even given her reckless behavior at times, Shuko wasn't that reckless. While there was no denying that every Uzumaki on the continent had a right to wish death upon all the great villages for what happened to their homeland, Shuko wasn't so far gone as to think her clan could weather such a conflict in its current, fragmented state. Of course, knowing a war was the endgame of this third faction was just step one. The next step was to determine why. No great village wanted a war. Even with all their militarization, Kumo would resist being drawn into such a mass-scale conflict. Likely, they would prefer minor fights with the other villages. Anoki of IWA, for his part, was far too wise, or, rather, too cunning to allow his country to be drawn into such a war, especially after the disaster stemming from the Third War, when Namake's Minato coincidentally enough, Naruto's father annihilated an entire battalion of his men. Kiri's rebels, led by the woman known as Terumi Mei, wasn't in any position to profit from a global war. The Kazekage, while renowned for his preference of material gains over friendships and such, was nonetheless severely undermanned and unlikely to gain much from such a conflict. And the Hokage Shuko repressed a snort. The Sandaime Hokage wasn't the type to seek a war. She had no doubts that even a minor skirmish broke the old man's heart. Still, she had to give him props despite their reputation as peace-loving hippies. Shuko's agents across the continent had heard of some pretty shady dealings carried out by Konoha agents. And there'd been that whole Amigakure affair, once upon a time, she supposed. Still, her musings brought her no closer to an answer, and she truly was quite curious about who would seek to start a continent-wide war. It had to be someone who stood to gain a lot. A weapons dealer? They certainly fit the type, but ever since her cute little clansman here in Konoha screwed Gato over, she didn't exactly have a prime candidate in mind. Perhaps the head of some fanatic, doomsday cult? Never since the Jashin cult was stomped out, the remaining members, if there were any, didn't have the clout or reach they once did. That left minor villages, and rogue factions among the great villages. The thing was, minor villages, or rather, their countries, tended to be, more often than not, the battlefields for such wars, so she couldn't really see what the payoff would be for such a war. Rogue factions also seemed like good candidates, except they'd always been around. Every village, big or small, had its band of crackpots who believed their actions were for some greater good, even though they always ended up screwing over someone else in the process, and ended up causing some bigger problem down the road. Amateurs, she thought. Like the shinobi currently keeping her under watch. Tashikone, she spoke up, catching the younger clansman's attention. Let's go for a walk, yeah? Tashiko blinked at her, before glancing to the side and nodding. Sure, AI-chan. Where do you want to go? Shuko smiled. Somewhere quiet. Training Ground 44, Forest of Death, 1. 5 hours remain on Chakra Seal, you're sure that's everything? Naruto nodded at Shikamaru as the teen sighed and adopted his thinking pose. The now reunited Rookie 9 had once again paused in their trip to the tower, having been forcefully redirected away by the pursuing Odo Nin, and Naruto had seen a chance to talk to Shikamaru about he'd experienced at the hands of Karen, June, and Tetsu. Needless to say, the Nara heir was not pleased. While the others had taken to resting, with Kiba and Sasuke on watch duty this time around, Naruto and Shikamaru were off to the side, talking out of earshot. I think they were lying to you, Shikamaru concluded in the end. And at the same time, I think they weren't. Naruto blinked. Well, that was damn unhelpful. Huh? Shikamaru sighed irritably as he rested his forehead on a fist. Look, they told you they didn't want you dead, right? That seems to be pretty accurate, all things considered. If this Shuko lady wanted you dead, why only change the timer of the seal? He asked, pointing at Naruto's wrist. Why not just seal all of your chakra away? Maybe she couldn't. Naruto guessed. Maybe it took too long. But any one of her minions, especially those who tailed you, could have done it while you were unconscious, he pointed out reasonably, before narrowing his eyes at the blonde. You can still feel your chakra, right? Naruto nodded, prompting a relieved sigh from Shikamaru. All right. See, he continued. Also, if they wanted you dead, they would have killed you instead of kidnapping you and holding you safe and sound inside a barrier. One of them broke my wrist, Naruto pointed out, unconsciously rubbing said wrist. Dislocated it, and let's be fair, you were never going to cooperate, Shikamaru reasoned. In capture missions, it's usually recommended to do so against uncooperative shinobi so they can't do hand seals. Are you justifying what they did? Naruto asked, growling. Shikamaru glared at his friend. I'm explaining what they did. There's a difference, he shot back. You asked me for advice, remember? Naruto grudgingly nodded, although he was beginning to regret his decision. Shikamaru, too, seemed about ready to give up on this. Gritting his teeth, he looked to the side, seemingly debating whether to proceed or not, before deciding his friend was simply unused to these sorts of complicated dilemmas. Look, I don't know what your clansmen were saying about sin of cowardice or whatever, but it's clear that part of your family wants to hurt Konoha. But if that was their plan, they're doing a pretty crap job of it, he pointed out, gesticulating with his free hand. As it stands, everything they've done, or said they've done, will just make your clan the center of attention and resentment when this all comes to light. In so doing, they would cause your clan to, at worst, be targeted for extermination outright by all the great villages, or at best, exiled and fractured. Naruto blanched at the options, but let Shikamaru keep going. Right now, he had to trust that his friend knew what he was talking about. He was pretty smart about these things. And while I'm starting to think this Shuko lady is a bit extreme in her methods, the Nara heir gestured to Naruto's repaired wrist, she doesn't seem to be the type to put her family in that sort of reckless danger. Otherwise, you'd be dead, or we'd be dead, he added, gesturing to the other rookies. Naruto was silent for a moment as he absorbed all of this. So what does she want? He asked. Shikamaru shrugged. With the limited information you've given me, I don't have any way of knowing that, he admitted. But I do know one thing for sure: she wants all eyes on the Uzumaki, he said before pausing suddenly. He narrowed his eyes and then pointed at his friend. No. My mistake. She wants all eyes on you. Naruto blinked. On me? He parroted. Shikamaru nodded, though he didn't elaborate further. He feared that if he did, Naruto would take his theories and guesses as sacred law, and think no further. If so, he would be burdening his friend with unsubstantiated guesswork. Truth was, that was the only pattern he had been able to discern in everything Naruto had told him, and what he'd heard about the Nami incident. Starting with Nami, the details of which he'd pried out of Hinata and Kiba, he knew that Naruto had been at the center of that particular dilemma, even if his overall fighting contribution had been minimal. Being singled out by the man called Tazuna as the leaders of the Nami revolt, the Uzumaki had been thrown into the global spotlight, and that translated into increased scrutiny of the clan leader, potential clan head, in this case. Then there was that whole fiasco with the chakra seal. There were hundreds of ways this Shuko lady could have manipulated events to her favor. She could have had Naruto's shadows alter his exam, or planted a proctor to deliberately fail him. They could have simply made him oversleep on exam day, and that would be it. Instead, they had chosen a completely roundabout way of hindering Naruto at not crippling him. For some strange reason, this Shuko lady, who seemed reluctant to rejoin her clansmen here in Konoha, had given her main obstacle to her goals a chance to prove himself. Then there was the issue with the Uzumaki's shadowing them. Smartly, Naruto had allowed Kiba and the others to continue believing they were simply jerks from Kusa with a grudge against Konoha. Naruto had only told him about their real identities as members of the Uzumaki clan. According to Naruto, they had been given standing orders to only interfere if his life was in mortal danger. That seemed odd yet again to Shikamaru, as Naruto's death would have cleanly eliminated Shuko's obstacle towards allegedly keeping the clan fractured. Even if they meant to force him to fail, the only thing the Uzumaki did was dislocate his wrist. Why? If they had broken a limb, or even just his legs, Naruto would be out for good. There were no medic nin among the rookie 9, and he doubted he could convince another team to help. If their mission was really as set in stone as Naruto had been made to believe, then it should have played out completely differently. Of course, he didn't share this line of reasoning with his friend. Even as he watched Naruto fret by himself, Shikamaru didn't feel confident enough in his conclusions to voice them outright at the moment. He needed more information. Specifically about this Shuko woman and Uzushiogakure, and in particular, about the fall of Uzushiogakure. Because of all the things Naruto had told him his shadows had spoken about, he had a sneaking suspicion that the sin of cowardice was the one thing they had been completely honest about. So what do we do now? Naruto asked, still looking quite uncertain about everything. He wasn't the type to sit around and think, so these situations usually made him moody and indecisive. He needed a clear goal to function. Shikamaru gave him one. "I'm willing to bet your shadows aren't going to be messing with the scrolls anymore," he reasoned. He had no valid basis for that, but he decided to trust his gut. "So we're going to do what we always intended to do. We're going to get that second scroll and pass this test." "And Sakura-chan?" Naruto asked. Based on what Karen had said, their pink-haired teammate was safe, but at or near the tower and unlikely to be in a condition to respond to her temporary communication seal. Shikamaru thought about that for a few seconds before eyeing Kiba, on the other side of the clearing. Ever since they had lost the Oto Nin, Kiba had been distant from Naruto, as though keeping something bottled up. He had a fair guess as to what, but figured this was between his two friends. Still, he needed him right now. "Oi, Kiba," he shouted, prompting the Inuzuka male and his puppy to turn their heads towards him. Shikamaru got up and walked over, followed by Naruto. As expected, Kiba's eyes narrowed at the blonde, but kept whatever he had up his ass to himself. "Sakura also got split up from us. We think she's near the tower. Think you can help us track her down when we get close?" Kiba eyed the two before glancing down at Akamaru, who yipped thrice. Kiba sighed and nodded. "Sure. Never leave a man behind, right?" he mused. Shikamaru nodded. "Thanks." He watched as Naruto tried to thank Kiba as well, but the Ninken user simply glowered and turned away. Before Naruto could get all prissy, Shikamaru put a hand on his shoulder and pulled him away. The last thing he needed was a fight between a chakra-incapable Naruto and a pissed-off Kiba. What crawled up his ass and died? Naruto muttered as they walked away, prompting a sigh from Shikamaru. False modesty aside, Naruto sure was lucky he had friends around to make up for his complete lack of social sense. Walking back towards the others, he proceeded to explain to Naruto just why Kiba was pissed off at him, and how it was, in a way, entirely his fault. Near the tower, 30 minutes remain on the chakra seal. They were lucky, Sakura mused, that the Oto Nin had apparently given up on their chase. She didn't know why even with Team Kiba's arrival and her own rescue, they were still outnumbered and had apparently counted on a medic Nin whose identity they had yet to figure out. But Sakura wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth. Ever since the second test had begun, it had been just one problem after another, starting with the fact that the Heaven Scrolls had seemingly multiplied spontaneously. Then they had been ambushed by 15 Oto Nin, who seemed hellbent on killing Sasuke and her friends. Then she had been knocked out while evacuating a temporarily incapacitated Naruto. Then she had woken up near the tower to the worried expression of Naruto and Shikamaru's relief. Then she had been told she had been out of commission for about 2 hours, while her friends battled unknown Kusa Nin with a grudge against Konoha and the unrelenting teams of Oto Nin. So yeah, in her mental scrapbook of childhood memories, this Chunin exam was probably not going in the top 10. Fortunately for them, however, Shikamaru had asserted that the weird thing that was turning Earth Scrolls into Heaven Scrolls was probably gone by now, though she found the glance exchanged between he and Naruto a bit suspicious. With that in mind, the Rookie 9 teams had resumed their advance towards the tower, keeping an eye out for any other teams arriving belatedly. After all, they were 2 days into a 5-day exam period. Unfortunately for her team, however, Kiba and Sasuke had insisted on moving on to the next stage, having already retrieved the 2 scrolls they needed. Though she and Naruto had wanted to protest, and the others in said teams had seemed reluctant to go along with their respective leaders, Shikamaru had acknowledged that they had fulfilled their end of the bargain. Unfortunately, that left her team without a tracker. However, rather than get depressed over this, Naruto had immediately turned to Shikamaru and asked how to proceed. Which was surprising to the pink-haired girl, given that he was the type to just charge ahead recklessly, or so she'd been led to believe. Even now, after all they'd been through, she found she still wrestled with herself to reconcile the cool, confident, capable Naruto with the knucklehead she'd known her whole life. Shikamaru, of course, had a rough plan already laid out. When they'd been running from the Otonin, Shikamaru had carefully memorized their path through the forest and then put that information to paper by drawing on the map. Given the lack of other teams that showed up during their extended confrontations, he extrapolated a rough area where no team should be presumed to be active. With that in mind, he had Naruto and her make a round of the tower grounds to see if they could find any tracks. Once he got that information, Shikamaru had put on his thinking pose for a while before concluding which areas were least likely to present an active team, based on initial starting points and the amount of tracks they had found arriving at the tower. Once he had those, he calculated the most likely avenues of approach. This spot they were hiding at was one of those. Naruto's sole Kage Bunshin of the day was at another. The problem was now waiting. Sakura estimated they had waited about 20 minutes, and already, Naruto looked like he was about to punch something on principle. "Shikamaru," Sakura spoke up. "Are you sure this spot?" "No," Shikamaru admitted as he lay on the tree branch, seemingly napping. The pose seemed to irritate Naruto, which she suspected was one reason the Nara heir did it. "But it's the best I got based on the information we have." Sakura nodded. She could understand that. Still, it would royally suck if her team was the only one of the rookie 9 who failed this stage. Ino would be unbearable. "Naruto's seal should be coming off soon," she noted, trying to make conversation. Waiting in silence was never really her strong suit. Nor Naruto's, for that matter. In fact, only Sasuke, Shino, and Shikamaru ever seemed able to sit still without making noise. Even Hinata would fidget. Sakura sighed. She knew she should be quieter. The most crucial quality to an ambush was surprise, after all, but at the same time, she was sort awful bored. She idly wondered if this was how Naruto felt like all the time. A twig snapping caught her attention, and she saw Shikamaru's eyes snap open. Off on another tree, Naruto had tensed as well. Slowly, she turned her head down, and saw what seemed to be 3 genin making their way to the tower. 2 of them seemed on death's door. The other, a black-haired girl with long hair, was shaking uncontrollably. Their outfit, more than their missing headbands, identified them as Otonin. In fact, the very 3 Otonin who'd come forward to threaten them when the ambush was sprung. Well, that made things easy. Sakura looked to Shikamaru, who'd silently positioned himself into a squat, and then to Naruto, whose eyes seemed full of anger. Likely, he felt the same frustration she did at having been taken out of the fight against the Otonin who'd ambushed their friends for so long. Shikamaru motioned to Naruto, who grudgingly stayed still. He then turned to Sakura and made a few hand signs that she interpreted as an order to quietly move into their path of escape towards the tower. If they were here, it made sense they were likely done with the test. As she moved away, she peripherally saw Shikamaru motion for Naruto to flank the Oto team, which meant he was taking their rear. It was a classic ambush, and one that was likely to fail against a team with such finely tuned hearing, were it not for their half-dead appearance. As quietly as she could, Sakura followed Shikamaru's orders to the letter, softly jumping onto another tree branch, then another, until she was positioned, out of view, over their path towards the tower. According to the classic stratagem, she would only need to jump into the fight if they attempted an escape. Many did, many didn't. It depended on the assaulted team's self-confidence. She had a feeling these would. Breathing in deeply, she waited for the signal, and wasn't made to wait too long as a defiant cry Naruto broke the forest stillness. Within moments, she could hear panicked shouting, followed by increased panic. Shikamaru's jutsu, no doubt before one of them very clearly shouted, "Run." That was her cue. Without a moment of hesitation, she dropped from her hiding spot right onto the long-haired girl, managing to slug the girl in the cheek before using her as a landing cushion. The Oto Kunoichi gasped as the wind was knocked out of her, then threw up to the side, much to Sakura's disgust. Getting to her feet, she saw Naruto had knocked the tall, lanky one with the strange holes in his hands, while the one who looked like he'd gotten into a fight with a bear and lost was caught in Shikamaru's shadows. "Bind them," Shikamaru ordered. Wait. All eyes well, those who were conscious turned to face the Oto Genin whose face was wrapped up in bandages. We surrender willingly, the Oto Nin announced, much to their surprise. Dosu, the sole female Oto Nin, groaned. What? Naruto asked smartly. Explain, Shikamaru ordered tersely. The Oto Nin, identified as Dosu, was unable to move his body, but still managed to convey a shrug. Two of my teammates are incapacitated by your hands, he observed logically. Though we were already defeated by another team, he added. Our chakra reserves are low, and, if you can recall, I used to wield a weapon that is no longer on me. Shikamaru eyed the Oto Nin's right arm and did in fact see that the strange object that had been there was gone. My team and I are of no threat to you, Dosu reasoned. And as luck would have it, we have extra scrolls. Any earth? Shikamaru asked cautiously. Shikamaru! Naruto shouted indignantly. He couldn't believe his friend was negotiating with these guys, after all they'd been put through. Even Sakura felt a little uneasy about negotiating with these guys. 3, Dosu answered calmly. See? We've got something you want, we just want to get the hell out of here. We both win. Or we could just knock you out and take everything, leaving less opponents for later, Sakura observed smartly. True enough, Dosu answered. But in that case, our lives are on your head. Sakura watched Naruto's eyes narrow. What? I may look like hell, but I'm even worse off, Dosu said calmly. Lift my shirt if you don't believe me. Cautiously, Naruto approached Dosu and lifted his purple shirt. Sakura gasped. Underneath was a slowly expanding pool of blood stemming from his gut. Akusa team got my teammates and I good, Dosu explained. Sakura couldn't help but feel wonder at the fact that he was talking so calmly, despite the severity of his wound. Kin is the only one of us who's not in any sort of immediate danger. Sakura eyed the girl at her feet, and instantly felt a little bad for her. The shaking, the puking, the moaning, she now understood it wasn't due to the pain she'd inflicted, but the terror she felt from that past encounter. She did wonder, however, why Naruto and Shikamaru's gaze had sharpened at the mention of the Kusanin. Zaku there has got internal bleeding, Dosu said, prompting Sakura to look at the unconscious teen that Naruto had attacked. He's unlikely to make it unless he gets to a doctor. Assuming we believe you, how do we know this isn't going to bite us in the ass later? Shikamaru asked. It was a fair point, Sakura mused. You don't, Dosu answered flatly. But all I can say is that Zaku and I are dropping out after this. If Kin wants to power it out, it's on her. Sakura saw the kunoichi shake her head frantically. Given the terror in her eyes, Sakura doubted she'd choose to stick around after this. So? Dosu asked. What's it going to be? She watched as Shikamaru and Naruto communicated silently via their expressions and body language, and felt somewhat left out. Neither even bothered to look at her as they decided how to proceed. Whether that was because they felt she was of no use here, or because they were locked in some macho contest, she didn't know. Nonetheless, she had to make her voice heard. Let them go, she said. Sakura-chan? Sakura motioned to the Oto Nin. They're done, guys. Look at them. If that guy Zaku is as messed up as Bandage Face there says he is, he's going to be lucky to live out the night. The girl looks like she's a loud sound away from losing her mind. Even Bandage Face is looking at a prolonged stay at the hospital, she pointed out. We take the scroll, and let them go. Shikamaru and Naruto exchanged brief looks before the former sighed, while the latter shrugged. A moment later, Dosu stumbled and clutched his wound as Shikamaru's shadow jutsu let go of him. Thanks, Dosu grunted out. He then reached to his back pocket, prompting all 3 Konoha nins to tense up, before withdrawing what appeared to be an earth scroll. As promised. Payment for safe passage, he said, laying it on the ground before him. Don't worry, I'm not stupid enough to try a backstab at this stage. Thanks, Shikamaru remarked sarcastically as he moved over and picked up the scroll. It certainly looked the part. One question, he said, even as Dosu moved to pick up Saku. The bandaged genin turned slightly. What? Why do you attack Sasuke? The Oto genin eyed him for a while before shrugging. Why else? Orders, he answered before bending down and lifting Zaku by the arm. Not going to say who? Shikamaru asked perceptively. Would you? Dosu asked reasonably before walking away towards Kin, who still looked a bit shell-shocked by her experience. Shikamaru smirked as he flipped the scroll in his hand. No, I suppose not. Mission accomplished. The Tower, Training Grounds number 44, Forest of Death. 10 minutes to chakra seal release, congratulations on passing, Kakashi told his 3 assigned genin. Predictably, only Sakura seemed particularly enthused at their situation. Then again, he had a feeling Naruto had confided in Shikamaru the details of his situation, but even then, they looked a lot more on edge than a simple chakra seal warranted. Sakura, why don't you go ahead? I need to have a few words with Shikamaru and Naruto, he offered. Ino and the others are resting while we wait for all the other teams to be accounted for. Sakura eyed her 2 teammates uncertainly, then nodded when they both gave her the tiniest nod of support. Hi. Once the sole girl of the group was gone through the doors, Kakashi turned his attention to his students in full. Kimiko told me what Shuko did to you, Kakashi told Naruto, before narrowing his sole visible eye. And what you did to yourself. Naruto swallowed nervously. He'd completely forgotten that he'd lied to his teachers, too. Did you tell the Hokage, Kakashi-sensei? He asked fearfully. Kakashi eyed his student for a moment before sighing and shaking his head. No, but I'm still not convinced that's not the right thing to do, he said. Naruto, your own clansman nearly got you killed. She's sabotaging village relations. Both genin blinked at that. Sorry, what? Shikamaru interrupted before Naruto could. What do you mean, sabotaging village relations? Kakashi eyed the Nara heir. He didn't seem remotely surprised about the chakra seal being tampered with, so he figured Naruto had come clean. Kimiko and the other Uzumaki think Shuko has been the reason so many foreign shinobi are at each other's throats these days. Well, more so than usual. Naruto turned to Shikamaru, who frowned and cupped his chin pensively. That doesn't make sense. Rather than condescendingly dismiss the teen, given his age, Kakashi had a feeling the Nara heir knew something he didn't. Oh. Naruto was briefly kidnapped in the woods by an Uzumaki team under orders of Uzumaki Shuko, Shikamaru informed his sensei, who looked stunned by that revelation and turned to look at Naruto, probably to inspect him for wounds he'd missed. Naruto's fine. The team was ordered to protect him at all costs if he ever got in mortal danger. They broke my wrist, Shika, said Blonde reminded his friend. Shikamaru glowered at him, especially when Kakashi sucked in a breath. They dislocated it. Ino fixed it in a second. Still hurt like hell, grumbled Naruto. Shikamaru rolled his eyes. The point being, why would Shuko try to cause a war between the villages when she's in one to begin with, and she actually tried to save Naruto? Good point, Kakashi conceded, glad he'd chosen to hear the boy out. Kimiko and the others thought she was trying to get Naruto killed to keep the family apart. There are much less troublesome ways of doing that, Shikamaru reasoned, before growling and rubbing his nape. Honestly, I don't have enough information to see her endgame. Kakashi shrugged. Neither do I, Shikamaru turned to look at Naruto. Any way to get a hold of Shuko? Naruto shrugged. Never even met her. Kakashi coughed. This seemed a good point to end their conversation, before any other teams managed to stumble into the room. Anyway, in light of this new information, I'm going to hold off on informing the Hokage on all the details, he said. But there's no way I can keep Shuko's actions against Naruto off the books. Shikamaru nodded, while Naruto blanched. This didn't sound good for the clan's plan to reunite the cells. I won't lie, this is going to cause some shockwaves, particularly given the Hokage summit underway, Kakashi told them seriously before eyeing Naruto in particular. Naruto, after you're all allowed to go back home, I suggest you talk to your elders. The Hokage is unlikely to be very pleased with this turn of events. Naruto nodded defeatedly before noticing his wrist was beginning to glow. What the umph? Shikamaru and Kakashi were by his side in an instant as Naruto fell to his knees. At the same time, Kakashi could feel the raw chakra pumping out of Naruto, despite his non-existent sensor ability. I suppose congratulations are in order again, he mused as he patted Naruto on the head. The blonde blinked in surprise before grinning. Welcome back. A park, Konohagakure. Later that evening, Shuko was humming a melody to herself as she kicked at the air from her seat on the bench. The park was deserted at this time of night as expected, and Tashiko had been sent off to deal with her orders. To the casual passerby, it might have seemed strange to see a little girl sitting by herself on a bench in the middle of a park at night. Or like something out of a horror story. Instead, Shuko had chosen to come here not out of a whim, well, not entirely out of whim, but also out of politeness. Politeness towards the old man walking towards her right now, his sole visible arm leaning on an aged wooden cane. I was wondering when you'd get here, she greeted jovially. I was unaware you were expecting me, the old man greeted tersely. You seem to know who I am. Shuko giggled. And you probably know who I am, right? Uzumaki Shuko, the old man said, coming to a stop before her, his body towering over hers. In the moonlight she could see the man's right side, his right, of the face covered in bandages. The phoenix of Uzushiogakure. The mistress of strategy. Shuko giggled again. They still call me those old things, she asked amusedly. I suppose I should feel honored, no? Shimura Danzasama, she teasingly spelled out his name. You've got quite a reputation yourself, you know. Lots of people want you dead. No part of him even reacted to that. Is that a threat? He asked calmly. All around them, she could feel the sudden presence of dozens of shinobi that hadn't been there before. Rather than panic, however, Shuko grinned. No, just a statement of fact, she said. Neat trick, by the way. Want me to show you mine? Before he could answer, she snapped her tiny fingers, and this time it was Danzo who noticed the sudden appearance of even more shinobi just out of sight. Each one next to one of his own. We think alike, he observed. No panic, Shuko noted. Likely because he still had the home advantage, and probably more shinobi in reserves. Props to him. Strategists usually do, Shuko agreed as she leaned back against the bench and crossed her legs. I don't think you came here looking for a fight, though. Am I right? You are, Danzo answered. Though I would rather speak to your true form, rather than this illusion. Shuko pouted. Afraid you'll be pegged a pedophile? She asked with a smirk. To his credit, Danzo was unmoved by the taunt. If either of us feared what people thought of us, neither of us would be here, he replied calmly. I would simply prefer to deal with the woman I've heard so much about, rather than the child she pretends to be. Shuko smiled. Flatterer, she said. Call off your men, and I'll do the same. Danzo stared at her unreadably. You seem certain neither of us will resort to violence. We have points of mutual interest that I'm sure will keep us from killing each other tonight, Shuko pointed out. Just tonight? Shuko grinned. I'm a realist. Danzo was silent for a moment before one of his fingers twitched. In an instant, half the presences disappeared. With a smile, Shuko snapped her fingers using a different finger combination, and her half was soon gone as well. Closing her eyes, Shuko then breathed in, then out, and let her chakra move towards the diamond seal on her forehead. Slowly, Her figure began to grow larger and larger until she became the size of an adult, with the features to match. More to your liking? Shuko asked coyly. Even though she'd aged, she still looked like she was no older than 30 years old. The vanity of women, Danzo concluded. Tolerable, he said. Though you bear a striking resemblance to the late Mito-sama. Shuko smiled. That's twice you've been a flatterer. Come, she motioned to the bench. Let's talk. Forest of Death Tower, 3 days later, holy crap. The tension so thick you could choke a horse. Naruto privately agreed with Kiba as he watched all 5 Kage standing before the assembled genin who'd managed to pass the second test. According to Sakura, who'd done a quick headcount as they'd waited for the Kages, there seemed to be about 40 candidates who'd made it through, of which the majority appeared to be from Konoha, followed by Kumo. No kidding, he added under his breath as the assembled Kage flanked on either side by Konoha Jounin glared at the genin. Honestly, he had no idea why they had thought bringing these insanely powerful people who clearly disliked each other together for a simple congratulatory ceremony was a good idea. Typically, Naruto would have been of a mind to crack a joke to dispel the tension. However, ever since the 5 Kage had come into the room, Naruto had felt his innards seize up in instinctive wariness. Looking around him, he saw he was hardly the only one. Nearly everyone in the room had tensed up at the sight of the 4 most powerful leaders of the shinobi world. Naruto. Naruto perked up at his name and looked to his left, at Shikamaru. The pineapple-haired Nara was looking straight ahead at the Kage. If you do anything stupid right now, I'll cage-main your ass out of these exams so fast, your head will spin, Shikamaru told him seriously. Naruto swallowed nervously and nodded, turning his attention back to the assembled Jonin and Kage at the front. The Hokage looked to either side before taking a step forward, moving out of the line. Naruto took note of the fact that the old man's pipe was puffing rather consistently. He'd only ever seen that before when the Hokage was getting very stressed out. Congratulations on passing the second test, the Hokage congratulated the assembled genin with a smile that looked forced even from where Naruto was standing. He wasn't the only one restraining himself, however. Despite Naruto's instinct to grin and boast, he found that, much like everyone else around him, he was desperately trying to keep it together. In all my years in service to Konoha, I have never seen so many candidates pass on to the final portion of the exam, the Hokage continued, finally taking out his pipe and holding it in his hand. You are to be commended for the extraordinary skill and valor it took to become part of this historic moment. Hiruzen scanned the crowd of genin, stopping as he hit upon Naruto. The young Uzumaki heir was desperately trying to keep a calm facade, but the Hokage knew the boy enough to know he was straining. Hiruzen chuckled mentally. Were it better, less stressful times, he might have enjoyed the tension-breaking antics of his favorite Jinchuriki. As it was, however, he was glad the boy had decided to show restraint. It is historic, he continued, because it has always been tradition that the final exam be comprised of no more than 10 competitors. He waited as the genin processed this information. As expected, the quick-witted among them realized almost immediately that the genin who'd passed in fact numbered 40, and so, by the Hokage's logic, 30 of the candidates had to be disqualified. But how? Logically, there was no fair way to determine that before the third test. Unless an event were to take place arbitrarily to cut down the number of final exam participants. Having given the genin their fun in racking their brains to figure out the answer, though he noted the Nara heir and a few of the brighter Suna and Kumo nin had figured it out by now, Hiruzen coughed to regain their attention. It is therefore my pleasure to announce that rather than hold preliminaries, as we have historically done, my fellow Kage and I, he motioned to the 4 incredibly intimidating individuals behind him, have agreed to expand the scope of this year's Chunin final exam to include all 40 of you. Were it not for the incredible tension in the room right now, Hiruzen would have expected to see and hear a few whoops of joy, followed by some empty boasting. Instead, he was met with dead silence, although he could see Naruto's eyes twinkle in barely restrained joy. That alone served to ease the stress from his body. However, given the unprecedented scope of this event, the final exam has been postponed until a month from now, during which time we will expect to inform you of the details surrounding your last task in this grueling process, he announced. Truth was, there was literally zero consensus among the Kages right now, save for the idea that the final exam had to be extended. Kumo and IWA had flooded the pool of participating shinobi with their own likely as a way to circumvent the restrictions on combat-ready foreign shinobi within the village walls, in case Konoha did anything fishy, and upon hearing the results of the second exam, had immediately moved to protest against the use of preliminaries. Hiruzen was hardly surprised. Was a proud man, and would have resented if not outright hated the idea of having his shinobi, no matter how low-ranked, eliminated in a shadowy preliminary before they had a chance to shine in the spotlight of the arena. Inoki likely had different reasons. Hiruzen could only guess, of course, but if he had to venture a theory, he would assume it was a delaying tactic for the negotiations. The bald midget had probably realized by now that Konoha was playing a game with the odds stacked against it, and was more than likely pushed for further concessions in the next round of meetings. The cunning little bastard was like that, always going for as much as he thought he could get away with. Raza's support for the idea was the most surprising, however. The Kazekage had initially balked at the idea of a, tentatively, week-long series of tournament matches. Between the expenses, the logistics, and the sheer inconvenience of convincing and convening daimyos and nobles alike to observe the final test, he had at first resisted the idea completely. It was only after the Reikage had pointed out that Konoha, as the organizer of the tests, should be made to shoulder the lion's share of the costs that the man had changed his tune. Of course, the one person whose motives were clearest of them all was the, de facto, Mizukage. The woman had something to prove the power of her rebellion against Yagura and had readily agreed to the proposal, hoping the spotlight it would shine on her teams would lead to increased interest in supporting her revolt. It was already a testament to her skill and leadership that the Mizu daimyo had, secretly, chosen to back her over Yagura, given the man's known wariness towards shinobi. Until our preparations are done, you will be free to remain in Konoha and train, he announced. To our foreign brethren, I would like to stress the latter part of my words. Specific training grounds will be assigned to each nation's representative teams for their personal use. He watched as a few gazes flickered over to the Kage behind him, likely seeking silent approval. When he saw them look back at him without further protest, he knew his colleagues had granted it. So for now, rest and celebrate. You have done well to reach this far, and I think I speak for all 5 Kage when I once again say, congratulations, and we look forward to seeing you in the final exam, Hiruzen concluded with a smile. For a moment, Hiruzen feared the room would remain completely silent, as the genin continued to be intimidated by the presence of the 5 most powerful shinobi in the world. Then, just as Hiruzen was going to outright dismiss everyone, he began to hear faint clapping coming from the jonin instructors, and turned to see Kakashi slowly and deliberately clapping. He was thereafter joined by Guy, who obviously refused to be outdone by his eternal rival, then Asuma, Kurenai, until finally all the jonin instructors and the proctors were clapping. Smiling, he looked back at the genin and saw their body language slowly change, as they realized it was okay to celebrate their achievement. Within moments, his favorite genin let out the whoop that set everyone else off, and Hiruzen was treated to the sight of the assembled participants cheering, hugging, and clapping. That was more like it. Even if the illusion of safety was temporary, he sympathized with these children's need to celebrate their accomplishments thus far. Who knew? Perhaps by eliminating the preliminaries, he could draw more clients to Konoha as well. If so, he might finally find the funding he needed to revamp the academy. Irika had brought it to his attention recently that despite the growing population, the number of available classrooms had changed very little over the years. The scarred Chunin had suggested adding a whole new wing to the academy to accommodate new shinobi candidates, but Hiruzen had simply not found the funding for it. A sudden spike of chakra behind him quickly drew him back to reality, though he was thankful it had been subtle enough to prevent the genin from sensing it. As he turned and walked back to his colleagues, he saw A and Inoki eyeing him like he was prey, while the Mizukage and Raza were both focused more on the genin. He supposed the two latter Kages had something in common: a desperate need for greater renown. Sunigakure was undergoing financial woes, as Raza had been all too willing in past sessions to remind him, while the Kurigakure rebellion needed further support for their insurrection. With that said, he spoke up again, raising his hand for attention. "You are dismissed. May your training bear fruit." The five Kages remained where they were as they watched the Jonin and Genin filter out of the room. Even as the children conversed among one another noisily, Hiruzen and his fellow Kage merely eyed each other warily. The Genin's latest stage in the exams may have ended, but for the five of them, the meeting had only just begun. I was the first to speak, the moment the last Jonin sensei had left the room. Now, the five Kages were alone, save for their hidden Umbu escorts. "So we're committed to this idea of yours, then, Hokage," the muscular village chief noted sourly. "No turning back for any of us now," he added to the other Kage. Inoki smirked and shrugged. "Any occasion to see your brats put in their place by their betters is good enough for me," Akun, the IWA leader, mocked. Hiruzen had seen this routine often enough during the previous meetings to know he had to put a stop to their arguing quickly. He raised his hands to both of them. "We can posture later," he chided both men. "Right now, we have to deal with the fact that we have yet to finalize the details of the event." "That's because you insist for the event to take place here, Hokage Dano," the Mizukage pointed out sternly. "While it is your idea, you cannot reasonably expect us to convince our daimyo to go deep into enemy country for a week." "I was unaware that hostilities had broken out yet, Mizukage Dano," Raza observed archly. "Should I mobilize my men already to meet yours in battle?" The Mizukage pro tempore glared at her Suna counterpart. Though both appeared to remain calm, the tension in the air went up fivefold. "Pedantry is very unattractive in a man, Kazekage Dano." "Enough," Hiruzen interjected. He honestly had enough of this bickering every day since they'd come to Konoha for the Gakage summit. His fellow Kages had done almost everything in their power to antagonize one another. It didn't help that he kept receiving reports of brawls between their shinobi, either. He looked to the Mizukage. "Mizukage Dano, it only makes sense for Konoha to host the final exam, given that we are the hosts. Were it to take place in Kurigakure or Iwagakure, or even in Kumogakure, I have no doubts you would press for the same privilege." "Something we will never know," Inoki pointed out, "given that this is an unprecedented event." "IWA agrees with Kiri on this. We push for the final exam to be held elsewhere." "Big surprise," Hiruzen muttered. Inoki had no real agenda here, other than to play devil's advocate and push for as much gains as he could reasonably get away with for IWA. Unlike Kumo's militaristic and almost paranoid approach to international relations, Hiruzen knew Inoki wasn't one to hold grudges. Unlike Kumo and Kiri, he had no interest in the events in Nami, or the return of the Uzumaki clan, other than it gave him an opportunity to press territorial and material claims. "Then what would you propose?" Raza asked flatly. "Given the nature of the guests in attendance, a neutral third party would be best," Inoki observed with a smirk. "Perhaps Ishigakure?" A snorted. "Some neutral ground. Isn't the village chief your cousin, you hypocrite?" Inoki's smirk never wavered. "Is he? I can't recall." "Perhaps Odo could accommodate us," the Mizukage proposed, hoping to defuse the situation before the Reikage and the Tsuchikage came to blows. "It's still too much of an unknown," Hiruzen objected, puffing at his pipe. "We have yet to even determine who the village leader even is. Combined with the sudden change in government, I would not be comfortable asking my daimyo to go there for a week." Still, it got him thinking. "What about Kuni?" he proposed. "So that the daimyo can spill their secrets every time they get a back rub?" "No thanks," A grunted. Hiruzen closed his eyes and fought back the instinct to rub the bridge of his nose in frustration. Overt signs of weakness, whether mental or physical, would be ceding ground at this point. In fact, he was even beginning to regret proposing the week-long tournament. Though, contrary to what the Mizukic had stated, it was not his idea. Rather, it had been, amazingly enough, Danzo's. He could still barely get his head around that concept. Danzo, the one man Hiruzen knew for sure would love to see every Kage, in fact, pretty much all shinobi not aligned to Konoha dead, had been the one to suggest a potential way to de-escalate the international incident they had landed themselves into. It was frankly mind-boggling, and Hiruzen was ashamed to admit he had gestured for an ANBU sensor to check that he had in fact been visited by Danzo, and not some hinged copycat. Of course, the man's clever little act of diplomatic strategy had him on edge now. Danzo had only ever resorted to advising him on how to proceed rather than doing it himself outright when he feared he'd be caught out. It didn't exactly make for a trustworthy advisor, but Hiruzen had to admit that the man had his U7 if he was officially dismissed from his capacity as counselor. It would seem that we are unlikely to find a suitable answer at the moment, Raza spoke up then, bringing Hiruzen back down to earth. The other Kage nodded, while their elite guards remained still. Even so, the tension in their bodies seemed to relax a little at the Kazekage's words. I propose we adjourn for the day and meet with our respective teams. They will likely value any advice or words of advice we might have regarding the upcoming tournament, he pointed out. If Hiruzen hadn't known better, he might have thought Raza's suggestion to be genuinely altruistic and generous, yet, while the man's dedication to his village was unquestioned as it was for every Kage, his propensity to assign value to everything, even human lives, reminded Hiruzen that the man probably saw his jin and even his children as little more than political pawns in this great game of theirs. I second the motion, the Mizukic added, unnecessarily raising her hand up to chest level. Hiruzen nodded in turn, preventing Inoki or A from unnecessarily delaying things. I agree as well, he announced. He watched as Inoki smirked at him, while it just growled. Fine, the Reikage spat, turning on the spot and already marching out, his escort at his heels. We'll meet again tomorrow. Send the time and place to the inn. A's departure set off the others. One by one, his fellow Kage dismissed themselves with varying levels of politeness, from Inoki's knowing smirk, to Raza's taciturn nod, and Mei's polite farewell. In the end, Hiruzen was left alone in the tower's fighting hall with his escort. Hiruzen dithered for a few more moments in the room, gazing at the gigantic hand statue set up in the rat hand seal. Under normal circumstances, he would have presided over preliminaries, congratulated the few victors, and then organized a traditional third round. In a month, everything would have been over. And yet, with this one incident, everything had been horribly derailed, threatening even to spill into all-out war. Honestly, he feared he was losing control over the situation. Whenever he thought they were making progress, the next day would bring news of another skirmish in the streets between foreign shinobi, resetting relations to the status quo ante. If he didn't find a solution soon, he feared he might have to start listening to more radical proposals. With that in mind, Hiruzen knew what his next move had to be. I'll be returning to the Hokage Tower now, he announced to his escort. Tora. Please find Danzo, and let him know I wish to speak to him in 1 hour. No answer was needed. Uzumaki compound, Naruchan. Naruto laughed nervously as he was all but tackled by a highly relieved and overwrought Hayako, who, despite her reputation for being stern and composed, had clearly taken the exams rather badly. She wasn't the only one. All around him stood the Uzumaki clansmen that had mobbed him the moment he set foot in the compound. In fact, if he just took 5 steps back, he would be back on Main Street. It was clear that they'd been keeping an eye out for him or news of him, and he found their almost panicky concern touching. It was certainly the first time in his life anyone had displayed such open affection for him in public, or concern for his well-being. He awkwardly patted the sobbing woman on the back, feeling that perhaps this was a mite exaggerated, all things considered. Sure, he'd been in grave danger throughout the exams, and sure, there was that whole business with the rogue Uzumaki, but they didn't even know about that, right? Bachan, he tried to interrupt her nervous babbling. Something happened during the test, your seal was tampered with. Naruto blinked in surprise as Keisuke spoke up, staring at him gravely or, more accurately, at his arm. "Yeah, how'd you know?" he asked, surprised. "Shuko came by," the old man growled. "She told us what she did." Naruto frowned, trying not to let his temper get the best of him. Takashi had often warned him that a loose temper made for fatal mistakes in a fight. While he thought he'd gotten better at reeling himself in, that didn't mean the irritation wasn't still there. Still, at the same time, he didn't like the dangerous looks his family was shooting each other. Like they were planning retribution. As much as he would love to sock Jun and Shuko herself, in the face, Shikamaru had raised some valid points that he thought perhaps the elders weren't aware of. "So she told you about Jun?" he asked, hoping everyone was on the same page. As he'd feared, they were not. Most of the clansmen seemed surprised by the question, while Keisuke's gaze narrowed. Even Hayako had stopped her sobbing and had drawn back, looking even more distressed. Naruto wondered if he'd managed to somehow make things even worse. "She sent Jun after you," she whispered in horror. "Naruto-kun," Kimiko spoke up, stepping forward. He mentally grimaced at the furious look on her face. Was he, by any chance, accompanied by a large, bulky man called Tetsu? Naruto slowly nodded. To his surprise, it was not Kimiko or Keisuke who reacted first, but Hayako. The old woman turned on her heel to face Keisuke, thunderous rage on her face. "She sent assassins after him, Keisuke," she spat, while Keisuke looked moderately ashamed as he looked away. I told you this was a bad idea." Naruto blinked. He hadn't known that. Sure, Jun seemed incredibly skilled, and Tetsu was intimidating to look at, but the fact that they were known assassins had somehow completely slipped his mind. The revelation managed to send a chill down his spine. Had they been bluffing about protecting him, then? But, if so, why lie? Why not just kill him, instead of just leaving his arm dislocated for a bit? Shuko has gone too far. Kimiko cried out, prompting similar cries of indignation. Clansman or no, to attempt on the clan head's life is an attack against the clan. Oh, crap. They were totally getting the wrong idea about what went down in the forest. While he did want some payback, he instinctively knew this was not the way to go about it. Yes, he would kick Shuko's ass at some point, but it wouldn't be on an occasion when his family would kill each other. Not on his watch. Wait! Naruto shouted, waving his arms. Unfortunately, it seemed his clan's propensity for emotionally unrestrained responses ran deep, and many seemed about ready to go gather weapons and gear to strike at Shuko wherever she was. Wait, please. They paid him no heed. He could even hear Kimiko start to order people to gather the rest of the clan to formulate a strategy to strike against Shuko's cell. Keisuke and Hayako were arguing loudly over who was more at fault over the idea of sealing Naruto's chakra to fool Shuko. He spied Takashi and Natsu both being reluctantly held back from charging off on their own by Maki and Hikari, who seemed equally displeased, while even Sora, cute, young, forgiving Sora, had a scowl on her face. In the face of such imminent violence, and with his severely limited patience already worn out, Naruto found himself with no other choice. "Oh, he roared. "Shut the fuck up." Now, Naruto was loud by default. Like most of his clan, he never seemed to have developed an indoor voice. By comparison, however, his roar done with as much lung power as he could muster was enough to have likely even caught the attention of nearby pedestrians on the road outside the compound. He wouldn't have been surprised if the neighboring Hyuga sent in a complaint later on. He might have even applied some chakra into his lungs, if he was completely honest with himself. Then again, it was somewhat necessary. It was really hard to outshout roughly 200 clansmen. In the end, however, it worked. Dead silence swept over the mob of indignant Uzumaki, who turned to stare at Naruto bewilderedly, as if stunned that a mere 13-year-old had the ability to produce such a noise. "And Naruto-chan?" Hayako asked in surprise. Naruto huffed, twitching just slightly from the rawness of his throat, post-shout. "Look," he said. "Yeah, Shuko did a dick move on me," he conceded, before quickly moving on as the indignation reappeared on his clansmen's faces. "But she also saved my life." Silence again. "What?" Hikari asked dumbly. Naruto sighed, before realizing that they were still out near the main street. Unless he wanted virtually all of Konoha to see his clan's dirty laundry, this had to be moved elsewhere. It suddenly occurred to him that he was being the responsible one in this whole mess. He mentally frowned. Another reason to punch Shuko in the face, whenever he finally met her. "We can talk about it, but not here," he said, motioning around him to remind them where they were. Keisuke was the first to cough in embarrassment. "Quite right, Naru-chan," he agreed quickly. He could hardly believe he'd been almost swept up in the wave of mob justice sentiment. He glanced at each clansman in sight. Everyone, back to the main hall. Slowly, with some visible reluctance, Takeshi and Natsu had to be punched in the head by Keisuke personally before they relented from their self-imposed hunt for Shuko. The Uzumaki clan marched back towards the main building of their compound, leaving only Naruto, Hikari, and Kimiko. The three Uzumaki who'd started it all. "Are you sure you're alright, Naruto-sama?" Kimiko asked, feeling a little ashamed of her emotional outburst already. She was the clan's enforcer. She was supposed to be above such tantrums. Yet, at the mere thought of this young boy, her future clan head, being endangered by Shuko, she had nearly lost her mind. Guilt was obviously a factor here. Naruto nodded with a weary smile. "Dead tired, but fine, Kimiko-ne," he assured her, before looking at Hikari, who still looked quite worried. "I swear." Hikari nodded matter-of-factly, then proceeded to pull him into a bear hug. As Naruto squawked in surprise, his head pressed against her ample bust, he heard her sniffle and felt whatever indignation he'd reflexively felt at being treated like a kid melt away. "I'm so glad you're alright, Naruto," she mumbled into his hair. "When we heard what Shuko said we'd feared the worst," Kimiko finished for her distraught clan sister. Naruto felt his expression soften, and he could have sworn he heard a disgusted growl from within his mind. "The Kyubi, most likely." "Thanks," he said softly, finally allowing himself to be pampered for this one moment. For a child who'd never had a family before, he imagined this was how it must feel to have older sisters constantly worry for you. "We should get going," Kimiko noted as Hikari slowly let go of him. "Keisuke-sama and Hayako-sama will want to hear the details of your experience with Jun and Tetsu," she observed, frowning at the names. She turned to Naruto. "Naruto-sama, I must remind you Shuko is not a woman to underestimate. Whatever Jun and Tetsu may have said, it may all be part of her plan." Naruto looked at her, then thought back to his discussion of the same with Shikamaru, back in the forest. He nodded firmly. "I'm counting on it." Keisuke stared at Naruto incredulously as the blonde Uzumaki finished his tale regarding the events of the second test. For all these days, the Uzumaki clan had been teetering on the edge, torn between taking Shuko into their own hands and assaulting the forest of death itself to save him from Shuko's madness, only to find out she'd played them like a fiddle. Keisuke heard a groan from his left, and saw Hayako pinching the bridge of her nose in a show of frustration he could completely empathize with. In hindsight, they should have known Shuko would do something like this. It was entirely within her character. "Sash isn't trying to kill you, Naruto-sama?" Kimiko asked for clarification. As one of the most emotionally affected by this whole endeavor, in part due to her own sense of guilt over having proposed the original plan to fool Shuko, she had also been one of the most surprised by the events in the forest. Naruto shrugged. "Who knows?" he asked. "All I know is that Jun guy said that Shuko wasn't some heartless bitch, and that their target isn't me or the clan, but Konoha." Something else Shuko had neglected to say when she'd come to visit, Keisuke noted. It seemed to him that the woman was playing two very different, yet simultaneous games, one of which had to be her master plan, while the other was her bluff. The problem was that both seemed likely. On the one hand, her isolationism, post-Yuzu, was well known. It didn't stretch any imagination to think that she would be desperate to win her bet. On the other hand, her reasons for hating Konoha were also well known, and to be completely honest, there were many Uzumaki not in her cell who felt similarly. Still, they had risen above these grievances in a concerted effort to find a new home somewhere they could finally belong without looking over their shoulder. So why was Shuko so intent on foregoing that? Naruto looked at them apprehensively, seemingly wrestling with something. In the end, it took a curious look from Hikari to make the blonde boy sigh, his shoulders slump. Keisuke-ji, I told my teammates what was going on, he informed his audience flatly. As he heard the sound of breath being sucked in mass, he soldiered on. Kakashi seemed aware as well. My sensei intends to inform the Hokage of at least some of what went down. Keisuke felt a huge weight being placed on his shoulders, hunching him over as he grasped his face in silent despair. Once the Hokage knew, his trust in the Uzumaki would be shattered, and he would be likely much less ambivalent about using them as pawns in the Gakage summit. How did Kakashi know? He asked tiredly. Naruto frowned, seemingly unsure whether to say, when the decision was taken from him. I told him. Kimiko was on her feet now, standing next to Naruto, her gaze fixed on the elders. With respect, Lord Elders, we are without allies, she reminded them, though she was clearly speaking to the assembled clan as well. What ties we've made to this village are tenuous at best, superficial at worst. We cannot survive this storm without embracing our Konoha comrades as allies. Such a statement might have caused a greater, more positive stir if it hadn't been about something so potentially catastrophic. As it was, Kimiko's remarkable change of opinion regarding Konoha's infamous copycat ninja was ignored in favor of her decision to leak clan secrets without authorization. Kimiko. Hayako was on her feet as well now. That was not your decision to make. All around them, angry mumbling agreed with Hayako. As naturally exuberant as the Uzumaki were, family always came first, and that was doubly true when it came to clan secrets. What she did will probably save our clan, Bachan, Naruto pointed out at that moment, earning him some surprised looks. He really wished they wouldn't look as stunned as they did, however sure, his reasoning skills weren't top-notch, but he wasn't some dumbass either. Naruto-chan. Naruto sighed, recalling the analysis Shikamaru had fed him. Right now, we've all been dancing to Shuko's tune from the beginning, he pointed out, slowly making his own connections. She manipulated the seal, she sent a team to ensure that I had either the roughest possible time in the forest, or to fail me, period, and we still don't know her endgame, except that June says it's about revenge. Naruto eyed the assembled Uzumaki clansmen. She wants us to stay quiet about this, he reasoned. Think about it, if we went and told the Hokage about this, we'd be put under suspicion, Akemi reasoned calmly from her place at the front of the assembled clansmen. Likely, they would take Naruto-sama away for his own protection. So why is Kimiko telling Kakashi a good thing? Takashi asked tersely. As far as I can see, that's just a huge fuck-up. Because she probably didn't expect us to do it, Hikari realized, prompting a nod from Naruto. Shuko-sama is a master at developing intelligence networks. It would have been easy for her to discover that our ties to the village are still tenuous at best. And our tensions with Kakashi are well known, Keisuke added with a pensive nod. But ever since Nami, we've been mending fences with the Jonin. It is entirely possible she was not yet aware of these efforts. Or maybe she does. Maki suggested, further in among the clansmen. As people turned to look at her, she got to her feet. Elders, maybe it's a double bluff? We've already established that she is probably well informed regarding events here in the village. Shuko-sama could have intended for us to approach Kakashi, to shore up our support among the village shinobi before the Hokage was informed. Naruto thought about that. It made a strange sort of sense, he supposed, and it did explain Shikamaru's insistence that Shuko didn't appear to be targeting Konoha better than his reasoning did. He turned back to the elders. Is that possible? He asked. Hayako sighed and rubbed her forehead. It's possible, she allowed. Keisuke was much less restrained. It sounds exactly like the sort of shit she'd come up with. But why? Asked another member of the clan. Doesn't she want to tear apart our links with Konoha? The guy had a point, Naruto had to concede. So far, all that Shuko had been saying according to the others was that she intended for her family to be left alone. By that logic, it didn't make sense that she'd act in such a way as to solidify those ties. He grimaced as he rubbed his temples. He was already at his wit's end with all this cloak and dagger bullshit. He'd never really thought about it before, but he had come to realize that his clan was remarkably varied. While most of those here could be called similar to him in personality, he'd seen in Raiden and his small clique of followers a set of very different personality types. Shuko, for her part, was annoyingly mysterious and cunning. June had been cool and aloof, even as he casually dislocated his wrist. Tetsu had been like being around a wild animal. Honestly, he was beginning to think that his idea of clans was incredibly skewed, if not outright wrong. The fact was, he had based his understanding of such things on the Hyuga and the other great clans, which seemed far more uniform. However, perhaps that was just an illusion, and under the surface, they were just as varied as well. As Keisuke began to speak, he drew his attention back to reality. Don't know what her plan is exactly, nor should we presume to, Keisuke said firmly. We have already been led by the nose on account of our prejudices and fears. If we want to face Shuko as equals, we must learn from our mistakes. Naruto watched as the clansmen behind him nodded in agreement. Truth be told, it was advice he recognized he needed as well. Much like the rest of his family had with Shuko, he had very nearly believed everything June had told him at face value. It had taken Shikamaru to make him realize he was being deceived yet again. It was not a pleasant feeling. He sighed. It honestly felt like he was still back at the academy, with Irika showing his errors every time he screwed up. Honestly, it was a bit annoying. Our first step, therefore, Keisuke continued, seeing he still had the backing of the clan, is to, he led off at the end there, his attention fixed at the back of the room. Confused, Naruto and the rest of the clan turned to see what he was looking at, and Naruto felt his heart freeze for a second in growing trepidation. Standing at the entrance of the main hall, what appeared to be a dozen ANBU operatives at his back, with Kakashi at his side, was Sarutobi Hiruzen, the Sandaime. And he did not look pleased. Moments earlier, outside the Uzumaki compound, Shikamaru didn't exactly know why he'd decided to come around this area, but had found his treacherous, troublesome feet had insisted on it. Now, as he leaned against a nearby wall on Main Street, he observed the Uzumaki compound's eerily silent entrance remained shut. It was a strange sight, and he wasn't the only one to realize that. Many regulars on the street had already commented on the fact that the normally rowdy Uzumaki were acting strangely. A few were openly disdainful, of course their dislike for Naruto transferring to the rest of the clan as well, but for the most part, their interest stemmed from sheer curiosity at such a strange and unordinary sight. Shikamaru-kun? Shikamaru sighed, turning his attention to the one girl he should have realized would also come here. Hey Hinata, he greeted lazily before drawing his eyes back at the compound. Checking up on Naruto? He didn't need to see her to know she'd blushed red like a tomato. The girl was astoundingly predictable when it came to Naruto. In any other profession rather cute. In the shinobi world a potentially fatal flaw. I just wanted to ask A about his seal, she mumbled barely audibly. Sadly, Shikamaru had been trained to pick up on such low voices all shinobi were, and so he sighed. It came off all right, he informed her. Just as we finished the second task. The girl probably nodded. From the sound of her steps, she also drew closer, and finally sat down on a nearby bench. Eventually, the silence was deafening. Sighing irritably, Shikamaru asked the question that begged to be asked. It's about more than the seal, isn't it? He asked as he turned to face her. Hinata eeped, then slowly nodded, studiously avoiding his gaze. Tu wanted T to know why he didn't trust you and Kiba enough to tell you his plan, he asked flatly. He really had enough of all this dancing around. People needed to be a little straighter with their intentions, log damn it. The girl silently nodded. Shikamaru sighed, and then proceeded to eye their surroundings. He wouldn't have been surprised if Kiba had shown up, but was staying out of sight. The Inuzuka boy had a strange aversion to emotions that weren't anger or excitement. He would have likely punched him in the face, had he asked if this was about Naruto's behavior. Because it's a sound strategy, he answered flatly, before poking her in the side of the head, much to her confusion. You and Kiba wear your hearts on your sleeve. You're ridiculously easy to read. If he'd told you, the plan would have been given away the second he acted weirdly. Hinata's head ducked in what he presumed was embarrassment and shame. Honestly, the girl was too hard on herself, true, but at the same time she had no notion of herself. She didn't realize that the one thing that was ostensibly giving her the strength to fight on Naruto was also her greatest weakness. He told Shikamaru eyed the girl for a moment, confused as to why she'd suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Then, looking up, he saw as four angry-looking Kyomonin walked by, paying them no attention. Yet, the moment she'd seen them, Hinata had frozen up. There was no need to ask why. The Hyuga affair was common knowledge among shinobi. Hyuga Hizashi's sacrifice for his village was the stuff of heroes, and still a major sticking point in Konoha-Kumo relations. While much of the initial hostility had faded, the animosity had not. "How's your family dealing with this?" he asked her, actually feeling some concern. He hadn't had much time to think about it during the first or second test, but the presence of Kumogakure shinobi in Konoha had probably set the entire Hyuga clan on edge. "And not well," she confessed. "Oda-sama is very irritable right now." Shikamaru mentally snorted. Right. About as irritable as the Kyuubi is large, if he had to hazard a guess. It would certainly explain why his father was more worn out than usual these days, following the routine Jonin briefings. A stuck-up Hyuga was already bad enough. A pissed-off, stuck-up Hyuga? Ugh. He'd rather date a blonde. This conference is really troublesome, he mused as he watched the Kumonin round the corner onto B Street. Pissed off shinobi everywhere. Hinata nodded in agreement, though she declined from saying it out loud. Thanks to her participation in the exams, she had been spared from the arrival of the foreign shinobi, and had thus avoided seeing so many Kumonin milling about. Now that she had free time on her hand, however, she couldn't help but feel as though her nerves were frayed from seeing so many potential abductors. She could only imagine what Niji was going through. TCH, Shikamaru clicked his tongue then, prompting her to look up at him. More trouble. Hinata looked up Main Street and saw what Shikamaru had meant. Walking no, storming down the street was a noticeably irritated Hokage, accompanied by Kakashi and a gaggle of ANBU. An unusual sight, given that the latter were technically supposed to be out of sight most of the time. Then again, she could hazard a guess as to why they were visible this time around. The Hokage intended to intimidate. But who? Shikamaru, on the other hand, knew perfectly well what was going on. Kakashi had already told him and Naruto that he would inform the Hokage of what went down in the forest. This appeared the only logical conclusion to such an event. Honestly, he was a bit more surprised that the Hokage had chosen to come with so few ANBU. He half expected the old man to storm the Uzumaki compound to retrieve Naruto. It spoke well of his character that he wasn't that reckless. He made a move to push himself off the wall, intending to follow the group into the compound. Yes, it was troublesome, but at the same time, he doubted Naruto had the oratory capacity to make his case convincingly when he spied Kakashi eyeing him. The silver-haired Jonin shook his head almost imperceptibly at him, and made a motion for him to stay put. Shikamaru frowned. Why? Did Kakashi intend to fill in for his role as analyst? Was the Hokage, perhaps, not in a listening mood? Was Kakashi banking on Naruto to be able to pull off this explanation by himself? Preposterous. You didn't face off with a Hokage with a handicap. You made sure you had every weapon in the arsenal ready to go, just in case you needed it. He narrowed his eyes. Unless there was no facing off. What if this entire stunt was prearranged? What if the intimidation factor was merely theatrics? But for whose benefit? Shuko? That seemed the obvious answer, but if so, surely more ANBU would have worked just as well. Or maybe it was the foreign shinobi. Shikamaru eyed the rest of Main Street, and he could see the odd foreigner looking curiously at the Hokage and his entourage as they made their way towards the Uzumaki compound. He leaned back against the wall, averting his gaze. Maybe it was both. A reminder to Shuko that the Hokage was not to be trifled with, and a show of force against the Uzumaki that the other great nations feared. Shikamaru had to give the Hokage credit. It wasn't a bad plan. It had almost convinced him, after all. Shikamaru-kun, Hinata said worriedly. Shikamaru sighed. He'd forgotten his present company. Unlike himself, she was probably flooded with worry for Naruto, and thus incapable of seeing the greater picture at the moment. Come on, he told her, once again pushing himself off the wall as soon as the Hokage's group crossed the threshold of the Uzumaki compound. We need to find the others, he informed her. That much was certain. If he let the superficial events taking place color their opinions, there was no telling how much damage that would do to the genin pool's dynamics. Therefore, he needed to set the record straight whether Naruto liked it or not. Stay right where you are. The Hokage's words had immediate effect. The Uzumaki clansmen who had begun to get to their feet to either welcome their village leader, or quickly get out of the room, were rooted to the spot. He watched as they nervously eyed each other, and felt some satisfaction at his ability to command such immediate obedience. Still got it. Naruto, naturally, was a different story. Throughout his short life, he had refused to see the Hokage as anything more than the kind old man who'd looked after him. Hiruzen had been the one to set him up at the orphanage, then pulled him out the second he'd heard that Naruto was being ostracized and bullied by other children. He was also the one on whom Naruto had depended for financial stability prior to becoming genin, and he'd made sure that his ANBU were viciously diligent in enforcing his laws surrounding Naruto's welfare. The one moment they'd slipped up had been the moment these Uzumaki had returned to Konoha. So of course, the blonde Uzumaki looked less intimidated than he did nervous, like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar in Naruto's case, the forbidden scroll from the archives. Again. Judging by the looks of this meeting, you are all fairly aware as to why I'm here, he said solemnly. As irritated as he was by this latest turn of events, Hiruzen had a lifetime of experience behind him to remind him that shouting was never the answer. It made for good intimidation tactics, but had no real use outside of that specialized field. Hokage-sama, we can explain. Keisuke tried to get to his feet and explain, but was halted by Hiruzen's raised palm. Kakashi already has, he countered flatly. I have been fully informed regarding the actions taken against my genin, he stressed the possessive, reminding them that they were, in fact, his soldiers, by this Shuko woman. Uzumaki Keisuke. I had thought we had an agreement. He saw Keisuke swallow nervously, and felt some minor satisfaction. He'd been giving the Uzumaki a rather loose leash so far, in part out of curiosity. Ever since they'd arrived, they'd already made great strides in revolutionizing some aspects of the village that Hiruzen had long felt needed reform. However, just because you had a few good deeds behind you didn't mean you could run amok. And it was high time to remind them of that. He watched Keisuke bow so low his forehead touched the tatami mats. He idly observed that Naruto seemed a bit torn, seemingly debating whether to shout at the Hokage in defense of his clan, or staying put. The source of his unease was likely the fact that he had never seen the Hokage as irritated as he was right now. We do, Hokage-sama, Keisuke said sincerely. We did not want to bother the village with our internal disputes. Your internal disputes led to a Konoha shinobi being sabotaged during the first 2 legs of the Chunin exams, Hiruzen reminded the Uzumaki elder pithily. It has led to an unknown amount of rogue shinobi infiltrating Konohagakure under false pretenses, and to a potential diplomatic catastrophe, should knowledge of these events come to light. Hiruzen eyed the assembled Uzumaki stonily. He could not afford to be seen as weak right now, so even for Naruto, there was no softness in his gaze. Moreover, said Konoha Shinobi is the village's Jinchuriki, meaning the magnitude of your mistakes is incalculably multiplied, he pointed out. Should the worst have come to happen, it may have resulted in the release of the Kyuubi in the midst of Konoha. And that was a memory he did not wish to see happen again. As a result of these mistakes, he pressed on, I have been forced to call for a postponement of our latest phase in the Hokage summit in order to deal with this matter. In so doing, you have now weakened our negotiating position regarding your family's future, as there is little doubt my counterparts will be informed of my presence here. That much was actually true. Even though he'd taken Danzo's advice and come to the Uzumaki in full view of the public, that bore diplomatic consequences of its own. A and Inoki were the types of opportunistic leaders that never let a weak point pass. If they thought they could use this internal dispute between Konoha and the Uzumaki to their advantage, they would exploit it to the very last drop. However, he then said, finally bringing out his pipe, a public show that usually meant his temper was cooling down. He could already see Keisuke's body language become substantially less tense. I have been convinced by my advisors, and Kakashi here, to show restraint, and allow your clan to explain itself. He puffed his pipe, letting out a small ring of smoke, as he eyed the room. There was a noticeable decrease in tension now. They were beginning to understand that he wasn't about to summarily execute all of them like some crazy tyrant. Uchiha debacle aside, it was really poor policy to wipe out an entire clan if there were alternative options. So, he asked after a moment of silence. I'm waiting. He watched Keisuke and Hayako eye each other, before Hayako took the lead. Hokage-sama, perhaps we should move this discussion to. Secrets are the reason we've come to this, Hayako-san. Hiruzen shot her down flatly. I would have this discussed here. Now that no more misunderstandings arise to keep Konoha and the Uzumaki from truly understanding each other. He took some private glee from the uneasy way the Uzumaki were shifting in the room. Even Naruto. The Uzumaki were still too entrenched in their survivalist ways, which had demanded great secrecy. The problem was that this way of living was incompatible with village life. If they wanted Konoha's citizens to trust and respect them, they had to measure themselves by the same standards. Understood, Hokage-sama, Keisuke said neutrally as he bowed again. As he straightened up, he motioned for the Hokage to join the audience at the front, near Naruto. Hiruzen decided to play along. Walking over to the front, motioning for his Anbu and Kakashi to stay at the entrance, he graciously accepted an offered pillow from a nearby Uzumaki clansman before sitting down. I suppose the first thing we should explain is the situation with Shuko? Keisuke suggested warily. Hiruzen silently nodded, prompting a sigh. I feared as much. Hiruzen watched as Hayako looked at her clansman, seemingly disturbed by this turn of events. This was clearly eating at them. They had likely never before been forced to reveal inner clan workings like this. Pity that, but they had brought it down upon themselves. Shuko is one of the 4 remaining elders of the clan, Keisuke informed Hiruzen. Yet, before Uzumaki fell, the elder council consisted of 10 elders. The Hokage nodded, noticing, amusingly enough, that Naruto was rapt with attention. He was clearly learning this for the first time as well, not that he could blame the clan too much on that end. It wasn't like clan politics was something that needed to be taught with particular urgency to a shinobi who was trying to make up for lost time. At the center of this council lay the clan head, Keisuke continued, unaware of the Hokage's musings. They were the 11th member, the tiebreaker. It lay in his hands to formulate policy and dictate Uzumaki direction. So the Uzumaki ruled as kings? Hiruzen asked, catching Naruto's interest. The boy had likely never thought about it that way, but in hindsight, That was exactly what Keisuke was saying. If all power was concentrated in the Uzumaki clan's hands, what was the role of the other families who chose to settle in Yuzushiobakure? Keisuke and Hayako exchanged a look. To a certain degree, the elder agreed. It's true that the Uzumaki effectively ruled Yuzushiobakure, but that's because everyone in the village was Uzumaki. Hiruzen blinked. Naruto blinked. In fact, if it had been possible to see through masks, the assembled Uzumaki would have seen that even the ANBU had blinked in surprise. Only Kakashi managed to retain the same look of casual disinterest even if the surprise was still present on the inside. I beg your pardon. Keisuke sighed. This is why we avoid telling people about Yuzushiobakure. It creates misunderstandings, he explained, resting a fist on his forehead. The Uzumaki are not as homogeneous as we make it appear, he explained, before looking into the crowd of his clansmen. Yuki. Raiden. Get up. Hiruzen patiently observed the two mentioned clansmen get to their feet, the latter far more reluctantly than the former. He began to see what Keisuke was getting at. Their clan name may have been Uzumaki, but the former's dark hair, and the latter's red hair, seemed to imply a far wider genetic diversity than was once thought. In the interest of preserving our village's unity, our ancestors decided that it would be best if only one family were to inhabit Yuzushiobakure, Keisuke explained, waving the two youngsters back down. So every family that joined the village, and all those who were already there, came together as one clan, the Uzumaki. Hiruzen slowly nodded. That would certainly explain how they had managed to maintain enough genetic diversity to increase their numbers again. Still, they had gone off on a tangent. How does Shuko fit into this? He asked, bringing the conversation back on point. Keisuke sighed. Shuko is the reason we're around. When Yuzushio fell, she was our miracle. She'd been on her deathbed. She managed to organize the survivors and was the one responsible for the cell plan. She even determined the best locations where we could live in seclusion, away from the politics of the world that had nearly killed us. That doesn't explain her actions right now, however, Hiruzen pointed out. It does, if one perceives her actions in their correct context. Hayako took over. Shuko is a fervent isolationist. She believes that all contact with the villages should be kept at a bare minimum. She blames the villages for what happened to Yuzushio. It's logical in her mind to seek revenge. And, if not that, then at least to keep the villages at a distance. Hiruzen nodded and glanced around the room, noting the reactions of the assembled Uzumaki. Most seemed stone-faced, as though they were well aware of this situation, and why wouldn't they? This was, after all, one of their clan elders. However, he took note of Naruto's uncharacteristically dimmed expression. Years of experience told the aging Hokage that Naruto was feeling torn about something. Something probably to do with Uzumaki Shuko. The problem is determining what Shuko's endgame is. Keisuke took over. She's deviously clever, and not above hiding her master plan beneath 24 other master plans. Already, we've received contradictory reports that say she's out for Naruto's blood, yet simultaneously keeping him safe. Now we're hearing she may be out to sabotage village relations, but according to one of your own, Keisuke looked to Naruto, who needed a moment before realizing what he was being asked to do. Oh. Shikamaru, he provided. Keisuke nodded. Right, him. According to Shikamaru-kun, her actions seem to go against this idea of all-out warfare. Which means, in the end, that we have no idea what she wants. Hiruzen sighed heavily and pinched the bridge of his nose, having halted his pipe puffing. This is hardly encouraging, Keisuke, he grumbled. It is Shuko's way, Hokage-sama, the Uzumaki elder replied levelly. She will keep us all guessing until she reveals her hand, and who knows when or what that might be. Later that day, Hokage Tower Hiruzen could only stare as Danzo escorted what seemed to be a child no older than 10 years old into his office, the old cripple making for a rather uncomfortable escort for a child so young. Danzo, what is the meaning of this? He demanded. You asked about my source, Hokage-sama, Danzo answered calmly as he and his guest stood before Hiruzen's desk. In that spirit, I would like to introduce you to her. This child? Hiruzen asked askance, gesturing to the red-headed child who looked like she should still be at home, helping with her parents' chores. Have you finally gone mad, Danzo? Danzo didn't bother to react to the insinuations regarding his mental state and merely glanced down at his companion. Perhaps you should show him your real self, as you did for me. Hiruzen felt a chill run down his spine. A hinged individual was in his office. Already, he could practically feel his ANBU guards ready themselves to strike. Yet, at the same time, his curiosity was overpowering. Danzo was not so insane as to try anything in the Hokage Tower, especially not during a Kage summit and the Chunin exams. The child, for her part, was pouting in disappointment. Fine, she drawled before closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. That's when Hiruzen's gaze fell upon the gem on her forehead. It was a gem he was quite familiar with, as his teacher's brother's wife had once held a similar adornment. So did Tsunade. Before he could react appropriately, however, he was graced with the sight of the child starting to grow in size, the hinge slowly losing its effect. Her childlike body developed curves, well-proportioned curves, at that, and her hair grew longer. To his amazement, even her clothing seemed to shift to accommodate her new frame. Whatever hinge this was, it was even more complex than that used by Tsunade. The end result would have been something out of his previous dreams, and yet Hiruzen was hit by a chilling sense of déjà vu as he lay eyes upon what might have passed as Uzumaki Mito's sister. Except Mito had no sister. Uzumaki Shuko, Hokage-sama, Danzo introduced calmly, while the now 30-ish-year-old Uzumaki elder smiled coyly at Hiruzen that, had the situation not been more critical, would have made him develop quite the nasal blood loss. Hiruzen was struck by the memory of his earlier conversation with Keisuke, who had insisted that Shuko's plans were impossible to read until she chose to reveal them, and how it was impossible to tell how much time they'd have to wait for her to make her move. I hear you've been looking for me, Hokage-sama, as it turned out, not that long. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share. Want early audio-only versions? Join me on Patreon, link in description. I'm Fox Sage, see you next time.